The Casting of Frank Stone. Chapter 1. The Pitch. The fluorescent lights of Cedar Hills High's audiovisual room buzzed with an insectile persistence, casting a sickly glow over the faces of 4 teenagers huddled around a battered projector. Chris Green, his lanky frame coiled with nervous energy, fumbled with a stack of handwritten notes. He glanced at his friends, Linda, Robert, and Jaime, each wearing expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to outright skepticism. "All right, guys," Chris began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I know you're wondering why I called this emergency meeting of the Cedar Hills Amateur Filmmakers Society." Linda, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, raised an eyebrow. "Emergency? Chris, it's Saturday morning. My emergency was deciding whether to have waffles or pancakes." A snicker from Robert, but Chris pressed on, undeterred. "This is important. I've got an idea for our next project, and it's going to blow everything else we've done out of the water." Jaime leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Better be good, man. Your last idea had us chasing squirrels through Oakwood Park for 6 hours. Chris felt a flush creep up his neck, but he pushed the embarrassment aside. This was different. This was big. He took a deep breath and launched into his pitch. "Frank Stone," he said, letting the name hang in the air like a forbidding mist. "We're going to make a movie about Frank Stone." The reaction was immediate. Linda's eyes widened, Robert sat up straighter, and even Jaime's perpetual smirk faltered for a moment. "The serial killer?" Linda asked, her voice hushed. "Chris, are you serious?" Chris nodded, a gleam in his eye. "Dead serious. Think about it. It's the biggest story in Cedar Hills history, and nobody's ever really told it. Not the whole truth, anyway." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know, man. That's some dark stuff. My grandpa still doesn't like talking about those days." "Exactly," Chris exclaimed, warming to his subject. "It's all whispers and rumors. But we can dig deeper, find out what really happened. Make something that matters." He turned to the projector, flicking it on with trembling fingers. A grainy black and white image flickered to life on the wall, a newspaper clipping from decades ago. The headline screamed, "Frank Stone strikes again, 5th victim found at Still Mill." Chris's voice took on a hushed, almost reverent tone. "It all happened right here in Cedar Hills. The murders, the manhunt, the secrets, and the Still Mill, it's still standing. We can film there, capture the real atmosphere of the place." Linda leaned forward, her initial skepticism giving way to intrigue. "It's an interesting idea, Chris, but how are we going to handle something this heavy? We're not exactly Scorsese." Chris grinned, grateful for the opening. "That's the beauty of it. We don't need to be. We tell it like a found footage film. Raw, gritty, real. Like we're uncovering the truth as we go along." Jaime whistled low. "Gotta admit, it's ballsy, but what about your dad? Sheriff Green isn't exactly going to be thrilled about us digging into old case files." The grin faltered on Chris's face for a moment. His father, Sheriff Sam Green, was a formidable obstacle. But Chris had come too far to back down now. "Leave my dad to me," he said, with more confidence than he felt. "This is too important to let him shut it down." Robert, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke up. "You really think we can pull this off? I mean, it's not just about making a movie. This is real history, real people who died." Chris met his friend's gaze, his own eyes blazing with determination. "That's exactly why we have to do it, Rob. To honor those people, to uncover the truth. Cedar Hills has been hiding from this story for too long." The room fell silent as Chris's words hung in the air. Each of them felt the weight of what he was proposing, not just a film project, but a journey into the heart of their town's darkest chapter. Linda was the first to break the silence. "Okay, I'm in. But we do this right. No cutting corners, no sensationalism. We owe it to the victims to tell the real story." Hamey nodded slowly. "Yeah, count me in too. This could be our ticket out of this town, you know. If we nail it." All eyes turned to Robert, who was still visibly wrestling with the idea. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "All right, I'm on board. But Chris, we need to be careful. There's no telling what kind of hornet's nest we might be kicking here." Chris felt a surge of elation tempered by the gravity of what lay ahead. "Thanks, guys. I promise we're going to make something incredible. Something that will make people remember Frank Stone and Cedar Hills for generations to come." As his friends began to pepper him with questions about logistics and planning, Chris felt a shiver run down his spine. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a shadow move across the projected image of the old newspaper clipping. But when he looked again, it was gone. The fluorescent lights continued their relentless buzzing, but to Chris, it now sounded like the distant hum of movie cameras coming to life. Their greatest project was about to begin, and with it, a journey into the heart of darkness that lay buried beneath the quiet streets of Cedar Hills. Little did they know, as they excitedly discussed shot lists and interview subjects, that the story of Frank Stone was far from over, and in seeking to capture it on film, they were about to become part of it themselves. The bell tower of Cedar Hills High chimed in the distance, marking the hour. To Chris, it sounded like the tolling of a funeral bell, heralding the birth of their ambitious project, and perhaps, though he couldn't have known it then, the beginning of the end. Chapter 2. Pre-production. The rusted gates of the steel mill loomed before them, a monolithic testament to Cedar Hills' industrial past. Chris Green stood at the forefront of his small crew, camera in hand, trying to quell the nervous flutter in his stomach. The autumn wind whistled through the skeletal remains of the old steel mill, carrying with it the musty scent of decay and forgotten dreams. "Well, this is cheery," Jaime quipped, his usual smirk failing to mask the unease in his eyes. "You sure about this, Chris? Place looks like it's one stiff breeze away from collapsing." Chris nodded, his gaze fixed on the imposing structure before them. "This is where it all happened, guys. We need to capture every detail." Linda stepped forward, her hand brushing against the cold metal of the gate. "It's like you can feel the history here," she murmured. "All those lives lost, all the secrets." Robert hung back, his camera dangling unused around his neck. "Maybe we should start with some exterior shots first. You know, ease into it." Chris turned to his friend, noting the pallor of his face. "Come on, Rob. We talked about this. We need to get inside, get a feel for the place. That's where Frank Stone did his work." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a moment only the creaking of rusted metal and the distant caw of crows broke the silence. Linda squared her shoulders, her earlier trepidation giving way to determination. "Chris is right. We're here to tell the real story, remember?" "Can't do that from the parking lot." With a nod of agreement, Chris led the way, ducking under a gap in the fence. The others followed, their footsteps crunching on gravel and broken glass. As they approached the main entrance, the mill seemed to loom larger, its shadow engulfing them. The heavy metal door groaned in protest as Chris pushed it open. Stale air rushed out, carrying with it decades of dust and the faint metallic tang of old blood. Chris suppressed a shudder, reminding himself it was just his imagination. "Lights!" he called out, and Hamey obliged, switching on a powerful flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a cavernous interior. Rusted machinery loomed like sleeping giants, and catwalks crisscrossed overhead, disappearing into the shadows. "Jesus!" Robert whispered, his camera finally coming up. "It's like time stopped in here." Chris nodded, his own camera already whirring to life. "Okay, let's split up. Linda, you and Hamey take the ground floor. Rob and I will check out the upper levels, Document everything, no matter how small. We'll regroup in an hour." As Linda and Hamey moved deeper into the mill's bowels, Chris led Robert towards a rickety staircase. Each step creaked ominously under their weight. "You really think we'll find anything after all this time?" Robert asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. Chris paused, turning to his friend. "We have to believe we will. Otherwise, what's the point?" They continued their ascent, the beam of their flashlight casting long, dancing shadows. On the second floor, Chris's light caught something, a glint of white against the prevailing rust and grime. "Hold up," he said, moving closer. It was a scrap of paper, yellowed with age, trapped beneath a fallen beam. With trembling fingers, Chris eased it out. "What is it?" Robert asked, peering over his shoulder. Chris's breath caught in his throat. It was a newspaper clipping, the headline still legible despite the years. "Frank Stone eludes capture, sheriff vows justice." "Rob?" Chris whispered. "This is from during the killings, before they caught him." Robert's camera clicked rapidly, preserving the fragile document. "How did this get up here? You don't think—" A sudden crash from below cut him off. Both boys jumped, hearts racing. "Linda? Hamey?" Chris called out, his voice echoing through the mill. No response. "We should check on them," Robert said, already heading for the stairs. They descended quickly, calling out for their friends. The main floor seemed even more shadowy now, the silence oppressive. "Guys!" Chris called again, fighting to keep the panic from his voice. "This isn't funny." A beam of light suddenly blinded them, accompanied by Hamey's laughter. "Man, you should see your faces." Relief washed over Chris, quickly followed by irritation. "What the hell, Hamey?" Linda emerged from behind a hulking piece of machinery, looking sheepish. "Sorry, guys. Hamey thought it would be funny to play a little prank." "Yeah, hilarious," Robert muttered, his face ashen. Chris was about to lay into Hamey when Linda's expression changed, her eyes fixed on something in his hand. "What's that you're holding?" He had almost forgotten about the newspaper clipping. As he showed it to Linda and Hamey, explaining where they found it, a chill seemed to settle over the group. "This is big, Chris," Linda said, her earlier irritation forgotten. "This could be our first real clue." Hamey nodded, for once looking serious. "Yeah, but it also means someone was up there keeping newspaper clippings about the killings." "That's some sick stuff." The implications hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Their little film project had suddenly become very real, very fast. "Okay," Chris said, taking charge once more. "Let's finish up here and head back. We've got a lot to process." As they made their final sweep of the mill, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of metal, every shift of shadow seemed to hide some lurking presence. Just as they were about to leave, Linda called out, "Guys, over here! I found something!" They gathered around a far corner of the mill, where Linda's flashlight illuminated a section of wall. Crude symbols were carved into the metal, a jumble of lines and shapes that made no sense. "What is it?" Robert asked, his camera clicking furiously. Chris shook his head, both excited and unnerved. "I don't know. But I bet it's connected to Frank Stone somehow." As they finally exited the still mill, the setting sun painted the sky in hues of blood red and deep purple. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of coming winter. Chris turned to his friends, noting the mix of excitement and fear on their faces. "This is just the beginning, guys. We're onto something big here. I can feel it." What he didn't say, what he couldn't bring himself to voice, was the growing sense that in seeking to tell Frank Stone's story, they might be opening a door better left closed. As they drove back into town, the still mill receded in the rearview mirror, a looming silhouette against the dying light. And in its highest window, just for a moment, Chris could have sworn he saw a figure watching them leave. But when he blinked and looked again, it was gone. Chapter 3. The first day of shooting. The pre-dawn chill clung to Cedar Hills like a shroud as Chris Green's beat-up Volvo rumbled down the empty streets. In the passenger seat, Linda fiddled with the camera settings, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the LCD screen. The back seat was a jumble of equipment, lights, boom mics, and enough snacks to fuel an army. "You sure about this?" Linda asked, not for the first time. Shooting at sunrise is great for atmosphere, but it's also when the cops do their morning patrols. Chris's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "It'll be fine. Dad's on the night shift this week. By the time he clocks out, we'll be deep in the mill." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. In truth, Chris had no idea what his father's schedule was. They'd barely spoken since their last blow-up about the film project. But he couldn't let doubt creep in now, not when they were so close to starting. As they pulled into the abandoned lot near the Still Mill, Chris saw Robert's car already parked in the shadows. He and Hami were huddled near the trunk, breath visible in the cold air. "About time!" Hami called out as Chris and Linda approached. "Another minute and I was going to suggest we film Frozen, the Cedar Hills edition, instead." Chris ignored the jab, his eyes already on the looming silhouette of the mill. In the pre-dawn light, it seemed even more ominous than before, a hulking beast waiting to swallow them whole. "All right, team," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get set up. We've got about 30 minutes before sunrise. I want to catch the first light hitting those gates." They worked in near silence, the only sounds the soft clinking of equipment and the occasional whispered instruction. As Linda set up the main camera, Chris found himself drawn to the fence line. Something about the way the shadows played along the rusted metal made his skin crawl. "Chris!" Robert's voice snapped him back to reality. "Where do you want me for the opening shot?" Shaking off the unease, Chris slipped into director mode. "Right. Let's get you by the main gate. We'll start with a slow pan up from your feet to your face, then pull back to reveal the mill behind you." As Robert took his position, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to see a patrol car or his father's stern face emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the wind rustling through dead leaves. "Ready when you are, boss," Hami called out, boom mic at the ready. Chris took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it, the moment they'd been working towards for weeks. "All right," he said, moving behind the camera with Linda. "Quiet on set and action." The camera whirred to life, capturing Robert's solemn face as he began his narration. Cedar Hills, a town like any other, until it wasn't. This is the story of Frank Stone, the man who... A piercing screech cut through the air, causing everyone to jump. Chris's hands flew to his ears as the sound seemed to reverberate through his skull. "What the hell?" Linda yelled, fumbling with the camera controls. "Where's that coming from?" The noise cut out as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a ringing silence. Chris blinked, trying to clear the spots from his vision. "Everyone okay?" he asked, looking around at his shaken crew. Hami lowered the boom mic, his face pale. "Dude, that wasn't us. That sound, it was like it was coming from inside the mill." Before Chris could respond, a new sound filled the air, the unmistakable wail of police sirens. "Shit," Chris hissed, his heart racing. "Pack it up now." They scrambled to gather their equipment, but Chris knew it was too late. The patrol car crested the hill, its lights painting the pre-dawn sky in alternating red and blue, and behind the wheel, his face a mask of fury, was Sheriff Sam Green. The car skidded to a stop and Sam emerged, his hand resting ominously on his holstered gun. "Christopher Allen Green," he barked. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Chris stepped forward, trying to place himself between his father and his friends. "Dad, I can explain. Save it," Sam cut him off. "I told you to stay away from this place. It's not just trespassing, it's dangerous." Linda stepped up beside Chris, her chin raised defiantly. "With all due respect, Sheriff, we're not doing anything wrong. This is a public space, and we're just shooting a documentary." Sam's eyes narrowed. "A documentary, huh? About what exactly?" The tension in the air was palpable as Chris met his father's gaze. "About Frank Stone," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "About what really happened in this town." For a moment Chris thought he saw something flicker in his father's eyes, fear, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold anger. "Pack up your gear and get out of here," Sam said, his voice low and dangerous. "And if I catch you near this place again, I'll have you all arrested for trespassing and endangerment." As they hurriedly loaded their equipment into the cars, Chris couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and curiosity. Why was his father so adamant about keeping them away from the mill? What was he afraid they might find? The drive back into town was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled up to the high school parking lot, their de facto headquarters, Chris turned to his dejected crew. "This isn't over," he said, determination burning in his eyes. "Dad might have shut us down today, but we're onto something. I can feel it." Linda nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "So what's the plan, Director?" Chris grinned, already formulating their next move. "We go underground. No more dawn shoots or obvious locations. We start digging into the town records, old newspapers, anything we can find about Frank Stone and the killings." "And the mill?" Robert asked, his earlier fear now tinged with excitement. "We'll get back there," Chris assured him. "But next time, we'll be smarter about it." As they dispersed, each heading home to avoid further suspicion, Chris couldn't shake the memory of that unearthly screech from the mill. It wasn't just technical interference, of that he was certain. Something in that place had reacted to their presence, to their probing into long-buried secrets. And deep down, in a part of himself he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge, Chris knew that sound would haunt his dreams for nights to come. Back in his room, surrounded by notes and storyboards for their fledgling documentary, Chris pulled out the newspaper clipping they'd found in the mill. His fingers traced the headline, "Frank Stone eludes capture, sheriff vows justice." The irony wasn't lost on him. Decades later, and it was another Sheriff Green trying to keep Frank Stone's secrets buried. "What are you hiding, Dad?" Chris whispered to the empty room. "And what really happened in Cedar Hills all those years ago?" As if in answer, a gust of wind rattled his window, carrying with it the faint, distant sound of metal groaning, like the gates of the still mill opening to welcome him back. Chapter 4. The Hidden Room. The musty air of Cedar Hills Public Library enveloped Chris and Linda as they hunched over a microfiche reader. The soft whir of the machine the only sound in the deserted building. Faded newspapers from decades past flickered across the screen, each headline a piece of the puzzle they were desperately trying to assemble. "There," Linda whispered, her finger tapping the screen. July 15th, 1973. Local man questioned in disappearance of mill worker. Chris leaned in, his eyes scanning the grainy text. Frank Stone, 28 years old. No charges filed due to lack of evidence. He scribbled furiously in his notebook. This must have been the start of it all. Linda nodded, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. It's like watching a horror movie in slow motion. You can see it building, but no one at the time knew what was coming. As they continued their research, piecing together the timeline of Frank Stone's descent into madness, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced around the empty library, half expecting to see his father's disapproving glare from between the stacks. "We need to get back to the mill," he said suddenly, closing his notebook with a snap. Linda looked at him, surprise evident on her face. "What? Chris, after what happened last time—" I know, he cut her off. "But don't you see, we're only getting half the story here. The mill is where it all happened. That's where we'll find the truth." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but we need to be smart about this. No cameras, no equipment. Just us, going in quick and quiet. As they left the library, the setting sun painted Cedar Hills in hues of orange and red. The streets were quiet, most residents already tucked away in their homes, blissfully unaware of the dark history Chris and Linda were unearthing. They drove in silence, the weight of their mission hanging heavy between them. The still mill loomed on the horizon, a jagged silhouette against the darkening sky. "Ready?" Chris asked as they pulled into the abandoned lot. Linda took a deep breath, steeling herself. "As I'll ever be." They moved swiftly across the overgrown grounds, staying low and sticking to the shadows. The fence seemed to groan in recognition as they slipped through the gap, as if welcoming them back to its domain. Inside the mill was a maze of rusted machinery and crumbling concrete. Their flashlights cast long, dancing shadows as they made their way deeper into the building's heart. "Where exactly are we going?" Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the creaking of metal. Chris paused, realizing he didn't have a clear answer. He was operating on instinct, drawn by some unseen force. I'm not sure, but I feel like there's something here we missed last time." They continued their exploration, the beam of their flashlights revealing decades of decay and neglect. As they rounded a corner, Chris's light caught something, a glint of metal that seemed out of place among the rust and grime. "Hold up," he said, moving closer. It was a handle, nearly invisible against the wall. "Linda, look at this." Together, they cleared away years of dust and cobwebs, revealing what appeared to be a hidden door. Chris's heart raced as he gripped the handle, half expecting it to be locked. To his surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a groan that echoed through the cavernous space. "Oh my God!" Linda breathed as their lights illuminated the room beyond. It was small, no bigger than a closet, but every inch of wall space was covered in newspaper clippings, photographs, and scrawled notes. In the center stood a small table, its surface cluttered with what looked like personal effects. A watch, a ring, a faded photograph. "Chris," Linda said, her voice trembling, "I think these belong to the victims." Chris nodded, unable to speak. He moved closer to the walls, his flashlight revealing the obsessive nature of the collection. Every article, every photo was related to Frank Stone and his crimes. This must have been his trophy room, Chris managed, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. As they examined the grisly archive, Chris's light fell on something that made his blood run cold. It was a photograph, newer than the others, pinned in the center of the far wall. "Linda?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this." She moved beside him, her sharp intake of breath confirming what he saw. The photo showed the exterior of Cedar Hills High School, but it wasn't an old picture. In the foreground, clearly visible, were Chris, Linda, Robert and Hamie, leaving after a late-night planning session for their documentary. That's impossible," Linda stammered. "This room hasn't been touched in decades." "How could there be a recent photo of us?" Before Chris could respond, a sound from outside the room made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching. "Quick!" Chris hissed, pulling Linda back into the shadows of the hidden room. He eased the door shut, leaving it open just a crack. Through the narrow opening they watched as a beam of light swept across the mill floor. Chris held his breath, certain that at any moment they would be discovered. The footsteps grew closer, and for a heart-stopping moment the light shone directly on the hidden door. But then it moved on, the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. Chris and Linda remained frozen for what felt like hours, neither daring to move or speak. Finally, when the silence became unbearable, Chris eased the door open. The mill was empty, no sign of the mysterious intruder. "We need to get out of here," Linda said, her voice shaking. "Now." They made their way back through the mill in a daze, the weight of what they'd discovered pressing down on them. As they reached Chris's car, Linda suddenly grabbed his arm. "Chris!" she said, her face pale in the moonlight. What if? What if Frank Stone isn't as gone as everyone thinks? The implication hung in the air between them, too terrifying to fully contemplate. As they drove back into town, the still mill receding in the rearview mirror, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line. They had set something in motion, something dark and ancient that had been waiting for them. And as Cedar Hills slept peacefully around them, Chris and Linda carried with them the chilling knowledge that the story of Frank Stone was far from over. In fact, it might just be beginning anew. Chapter 5, The Cursed Film Fragment. The Green family kitchen was a battlefield of tension, the silence broken only by the clink of cutlery against plates. Chris pushed his meatloaf around, appetite lost in the whirlwind of recent discoveries. Across the table, Sheriff Sam Green's stern gaze bored into him. "You've been awful quiet lately, son," Sam said, breaking the silence. "Anything you want to tell me?" Chris met his father's eyes, weighing his words carefully. "Just focused on school, Dad. You know, senior year and all." Sam's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Uh-huh. And I suppose that's why Mrs. Johnson saw you and Linda sneaking out of the library after hours." A chill ran down Chris's spine, but he kept his face neutral. "We were doing research for a history project. Lost track of time." The lie hung between them, as tangible as the uneaten food on their plates. Sam opened his mouth to respond when the phone's shrill ring cut through the tension. "Green residence," Sam answered, his eyes never leaving Chris. His expression shifted, concern creeping into his features. "Bonnie, slow down, what's wrong?" Chris perked up at the mention of his aunt's name. Bonnie Rivera, his mother's sister, had always been the black sheep of the family. Wild, unpredictable, and according to the whispers he'd overheard, touched by the tragedy of Frank Stone's reign of terror. Sam's face grew grimmer as he listened. All right, I'll be right over. Just don't touch anything, okay?" As Sam hung up and reached for his jacket, Chris stood. "What's going on? Is Aunt Bonnie okay?" "Stay here, Chris," Sam ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "This doesn't concern you." But, as the door slammed behind his father, Chris knew he couldn't obey. Whatever was happening with Aunt Bonnie, he was certain it was connected to their investigation. 10 minutes later, Chris's Volvo crawled down Maple Street, coming to a stop a few houses down from Bonnie's dilapidated Victorian. His father's patrol car was parked in the driveway, its lights off but its presence ominous. Chris slipped out of his car, staying low as he crept around the back of the house. The kitchen window was cracked open, voices drifting out into the night. ... See, "And keep it here anymore, Sam," Bonnie was saying, her voice trembling. It's alive, I swear it. I can hear it at night, whispering." "Bonnie, listen to me." Sam's voice was low, urgent. "No one can know about this. If people found out you had a piece of that, there'd be panic. You remember what it was like back then?" Chris's heart raced. A piece of what? What were they hiding? Suddenly, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He whirled, coming face to face with Linda. "Jesus, Linda," he hissed. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she whispered back. "I saw your car and figured you'd be snooping. What's going on?" Before Chris could answer, the back door creaked open. They froze, caught in the spill of light from the kitchen. Bonnie Rivera stood in the doorway, her wild hair framing a face etched with fear, and something else, a feverish excitement that made Chris's skin crawl. "I thought I heard something," she said, her eyes darting between Chris and Linda. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Aunt Bonnie," Chris started, but she cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Oh, it's too late now. You're already part of it, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes." She glanced over her shoulder, then beckoned them inside. "Quickly, before your father comes back." They followed her into the cluttered kitchen, the air heavy with the scent of incense and something metallic like old pennies. Sam was nowhere to be seen. "He's upstairs looking for it," Bonnie said, answering their unspoken question. "But he won't find it. It doesn't want to be found by him. "Find what, Aunt Bonnie?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bonnie's eyes gleamed in the dim light. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, ornate box. "This," she said, her voice reverent. "A piece of history, a piece of him." With trembling hands, she opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a strip of film, no more than a few inches long. Linda leaned in, her face a mask of confusion. "Is that Super 8 film?" Bonnie nodded, her fingers hovering over the film as if afraid to touch it. "It's all that's left of Frank Stone's last project, the one that was never finished." Chris felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, his last project?" "They never told you the whole story, did they?" Bonnie's voice was bitter. "Frank Stone wasn't just a killer. He was an artist, a visionary. He believed he could capture something beyond our world." She picked up the film strip, holding it up to the light. For a moment, Chris thought he saw something move within the frames, but it was gone before he could be sure. "This is dangerous, Aunt Bonnie," he said, fighting the urge to snatch the film away. "We should turn it over to the police or—" "The police?" Bonnie laughed, the sound harsh and brittle. "They're part of the cover-up, Chris. Your father, the mayor, all of them. They've been hiding the truth for decades." Footsteps sounded overhead, and Bonnie's eyes widened in panic. "You need to go, now. But take this." She thrust the box into Chris's hands. "It's part of your story now. Just be careful. Once you look, you can't unsee." They slipped out the back door just as Sam's heavy tread reached the top of the stairs. As they ran back to Chris's car, the weight of the box seemed to burn in his pocket. Later, huddled in Chris's bedroom, they stared at the film strip, neither willing to be the first to suggest watching it. "This is crazy," Linda said, her voice hushed. "We should destroy it, Chris." "Whatever this is, it's bad news." But Chris couldn't take his eyes off the film. He could have sworn he saw faces flickering in the frames, mouths open in silent screams. "We have to know," he said finally. "For the documentary, for the truth." With shaking hands, he loaded the film into his father's old Super 8 projector. As the machine whirred to life, casting its beam on the blank wall, Chris and Linda held their breath. The images that flickered before them defied description. Faces contorted in agony, landscapes that couldn't exist in nature, and through it all a shadowy figure that seemed to stare directly at them, its eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. As the last frame flickered past, Chris felt a shift in the air, as if reality itself had been altered. Linda's face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" she stammered. "What was that?" Before Chris could answer, a sound from downstairs made them both jump. The front door had opened. "Chris," his father's voice called up, "we need to talk." Chris and Linda exchanged panicked looks. The projector continued to whir, the blank wall now a silent witness to the horror they had unleashed. As Sam's footsteps approached the bedroom, Chris realized with a sinking feeling that their innocent documentary project had just become something far more dangerous and far more real than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 6. The Curious Shopkeeper. The bell above the door of Cher's Curiosities jangled discordantly as Chris, Linda, Robert and Hamie stepped into the dimly lit shop. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows, illuminating shelves crammed with an eclectic assortment of antiques, oddities, and what could generously be called junk. "Are you sure about this place?" Robert whispered, eyeing a stuffed two-headed calf with obvious discomfort. "It looks like the kind of shop where you accidentally buy a cursed monkey's paw or something." Chris nodded, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Aunt Bonnie mentioned this place. Said the owner might have some props we could use for the documentary. Plus," he added, lowering his voice, "she hinted that Cher knows things about Cedar Hills that most people don't." "Great," Hammy muttered. Another creepy old person with dark secrets. Just what this town needs. As they made their way deeper into the shop, the clutter seemed to close in around them. Vintage cameras shared shelf space with crystal balls, while mannequin parts were haphazardly mixed with old medical equipment. The overall effect was unsettling, as if the boundaries between the mundane and the macabre had blurred. "Can I help you?" The voice, sharp and sudden, made them all jump. They turned to find a woman regarding them with keen interest. Cher, for it could only be her, was a study in contrasts. Her silver hair was cut in a severe bob, but her eyes sparkled with barely contained mischief. She wore a flowing bohemian dress that seemed at odds with her no-nonsense demeanour. Yes," Chris stammered, caught off guard. "We're working on a documentary about Cedar Hills history, and we were hoping to find some props or artifacts that might be relevant." Cher's eyes narrowed, her gaze seeming to pierce right through Chris. "A documentary, you say? About what aspect of our fair town's history?" Chris hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Linda stepped in smoothly. "We're particularly interested in the industrial period. The still mill, its impact on the town, that sort of thing." "Ah," Cher said, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "The still mill. Now that's a subject ripe with possibility." She moved behind the cluttered counter, rummaging through drawers. "I might have just the things for you. Authentic pieces, mind you, not reproductions."
As Cher searched, Chris's attention was drawn to a display case near the counter.
Inside, nestled on a faded velvet cushion, was a tarnished silver pocket watch. Something about it tugged at his memory. "Here we are," Cher announced, setting a small collection of items on the counter. "These should add some authenticity to your project." The group gathered around, examining the objects. There was a heavy iron key, its teeth complex and worn, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age, a small, ornate hand mirror with a crack running through its surface, and a set of work gloves, the leather stiff and darkened with what looked unsettlingly like old bloodstains. "These all came from the mill?" Hammy asked, picking up the key and testing its weight in his hand. Cher nodded, her eyes never leaving Chris. "Oh yes. Each item has quite a story, I assure you. That key, for instance, opens a door that some say should have remained locked. The journal belonged to a foreman who saw things he couldn't explain. The mirror, well, they say it sometimes reflects more than just this world. And those gloves." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They've handled things not meant for human touch." A chill ran through the group at her words. Robert set down the mirror he'd been examining as if it had suddenly become red-hot. "How much?" Chris asked, his voice hoarse. Cher named a price that was surprisingly reasonable, given the apparent significance of the items. As Linda counted out the cash, Chris found his gaze drawn back to the pocket watch in the display case. "What about that?" he asked, pointing to the watch. "Is that from the mill too?" A strange expression flitted across Cher's face, surprise mixed with something that might have been fear. "That's not for sale," she said quickly. "Family heirloom, just for display." But Chris couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen the watch before. Then it hit him, in the hidden room at the mill among the victim's personal effects. His heart began to race. As they gathered their purchases and prepared to leave, Cher's voice stopped them. "A word of advice," she said, all trace of salesmanship gone from her tone. "Be careful what you go looking for in Cedar Hills. Some stories are better left untold, some doors better left unopened." They stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, each lost in thought. The brown paper bag containing their new props seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. "Well, that was sufficiently creepy," Jaime said, breaking the silence. "Anyone else feel like we just signed up for a low-budget horror movie?" Linda shook her head, her expression troubled. "This is more than just props for a documentary now, isn't it, Chris? We're actually investigating Frank Stone." Chris nodded slowly, the weight of their undertaking settling on his shoulders. "I think we have been all along. We just didn't realize how deep this goes." As they walked back to their cars, Chris couldn't shake the image of the pocket watch from his mind. He was certain now that it had belonged to one of Frank Stone's victims. But why did Cher have it? And why was she so reluctant to part with it? The sun was setting as they drove back into town, casting long shadows across the streets of Cedar Hills. In the fading light, familiar buildings took on a sinister aspect, as if the town itself was transforming into something darker, something hungry. In the passenger seat, Linda examined a leather-bound journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly she gasped. "Chris," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." She held up the journal open to a page near the back. There, in faded ink, was a crude drawing of a symbol, the same symbol they had seen carved into the wall of the still mill. As Chris stared at the image, a cold certainty settled in his gut. They had stumbled onto something far bigger and far more dangerous than a simple documentary project. The story of Frank Stone was a labyrinth, and they had just taken their first steps into its dark heart. The items from Cher's shop sat between them, no longer mere props, but tangible links to a past that refused to stay buried. And as Cedar Hills disappeared in the rearview mirror, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the town, and whatever sinister forces lurked within it, was watching them, waiting to see what they would do next. Chapter 7. Reality Bleeds. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Cedar Hills loomed before them, a hulking shadow against the pre-dawn sky. Chris surveyed the scene, a mixture of excitement and trepidation churning in his gut. They had chosen this location as a stand-in for the still mill, close enough to capture the industrial grime, but far enough to avoid his father's watchful eye. "All right, people," Chris called out, clapping his hands to get everyone's attention. "Let's get set up. We've got about an hour before sunrise, and I want to catch that perfect creepy morning light." As Robert and Hamie began unpacking the equipment, Linda approached Chris, her face etched with concern. "Are you sure about using the items from Cher's shop?" she asked in a low voice. "After what we saw in that journal." Chris nodded, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "We need all the authenticity we can get. Besides," he added with a wry smile, "a little creep factor might be just what this scene needs." They had decided to recreate one of Frank Stone's alleged encounters with a victim, using the journal entries as a guide. Robert would play Frank, while Hamie had reluctantly agreed to portray the unfortunate mill worker. As the sky began to lighten, casting long shadows across the warehouse floor, Chris called for quiet on the set. Robert took his position, the tarnished pocket watch from Cher's shop gleaming dully in his hand. "Action!" Chris called, and the scene began to unfold. Robert, his face a mask of calculated menace, approached Hamie, who cowered convincingly against a rusted piece of machinery. "Do you know what time it is?" Robert asked, his voice low and threatening as he held up the watch. Suddenly, a gust of wind whipped through the warehouse, causing everyone to shiver. Chris frowned. All the doors and windows were supposed to be closed. As Robert continued his lines, Chris noticed something odd through his viewfinder. The background seemed to be shifting, the shadows deepening and taking on strange, writhing forms. "Cut!" he called out, but neither Robert nor Hamie seemed to hear him. They continued the scene, their movements becoming jerky and unnatural. "I said cut!" Chris shouted, a note of panic creeping into his voice. But it was as if a barrier had formed between him and the actors, a shimmer in the air that distorted sight and sound. Linda grabbed his arm, her face pale. "Chris, look!" He followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. The pocket watch in Robert's hand was moving on its own, the hands spinning wildly, and behind the actors the warehouse walls seemed to be melting away, revealing glimpses of the still mill as it must have looked decades ago. "Robert!" "Jaime!" Linda screamed, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. On the otherworldly stage before them, the scene had taken a horrifying turn. Robert's face had transformed, his features twisting into something inhuman. He loomed over Jaime, who was no longer acting but genuinely terrified, scrambling to escape. Chris lunged forward, determined to break whatever spell had fallen over his friends, but an invisible force held him back. He could only watch in horror as Robert, or the thing wearing Robert's face, reached for Jaime with elongated claw-like fingers. Just as those terrible hands were about to close around Jaime's throat, a piercing shriek cut through the air. The pocket watch exploded in a shower of gears and springs, and reality seemed to snap back into place like an overstretched rubber band. Chris stumbled forward, catching Robert as he collapsed. Jaime fell to his knees, gasping for air. The warehouse was once again just a warehouse, the early morning light spilling through grimy windows. What just happened?" Linda whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the sound of slow, deliberate applause echoed through the cavernous space. They all turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a man in a nondescript suit, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. "Bravo!" the man said, his voice smooth and cultured. "That was quite a performance. You're getting closer to the truth than you know." Chris stepped forward, placing himself between the stranger and his friends. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Augustine Lieber, and what I want, young filmmaker, is to see how your little project develops. You're playing with forces you don't understand, but—" He paused, his gaze sweeping over the shaken group. "Perhaps you have the potential to understand them." "Forces," Chris repeated, his mind reeling. "You mean, what just happened, that was real?" Augustine's smile widened. "As real as anything in Cedar Hills. The veil between worlds is thin here, especially when it comes to Frank Stone's legacy. Your little film, it's not just telling a story, it's awakening something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, offering it to Chris. "When you're ready to learn more, and believe me, you will be, give me a call. In the meantime," his eyes flickered to the scattered remains of the pocket watch, "I'd be careful with those props of yours. Some things don't like being used as mere set dressing." With that, Augustine turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as suddenly as he had appeared. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the group and the distant call of morning birds, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded. Finally, Jaime broke the silence. "Okay, I'm out," he said, his voice cracking. "This is way too weird. I signed up for a student film, not whatever the hell that was." Robert nodded, still looking dazed. "Yeah, I think I need some time to process this." Chris wanted to argue, to convince them to stay, but the words died in his throat. How could he ask them to continue after what they'd just experienced? As Robert and Jaime gathered their things and left, Chris turned to Linda. "What do we do now?" he asked, hating how lost he sounded. Linda picked up the business card Augustine had left, turning it over in her hands. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I think we're in too deep to back out now. Whatever's going on in Cedar Hills, whatever Frank Stone was involved in, it's real, Chris, and I think we might be the only ones who can uncover the truth." Chris nodded slowly, his gaze drawn to the scattered pieces of the pocket watch. Each fragment seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. As they packed up their equipment, the weight of their discovery settled over them like a shroud. Their simple documentary had become a journey into darkness, a quest for a truth that might be better left buried. But as they stepped out of the warehouse into the full light of morning, Chris knew there was no turning back. The story of Frank Stone had claimed them, and one way or another, they would see it through to its terrifying conclusion. Chapter 8. The Sheriff's Warning. The Green family kitchen had never felt so small. Chris sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him, Sheriff Sam Green paced back and forth, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "I know what you've been up to," Sam finally said, his voice low and controlled. "The mill, share shop, that old warehouse. Did you really think you could keep this from me in a town like Cedar Hills?"
Chris met his father's gaze, summoning every ounce of defiance he could muster.
"We're not doing anything wrong, Dad. It's just a documentary." Sam's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Just a documentary." "Son, you have no idea what you're meddling with. Then tell me," Chris shot back, frustration boiling over. "You've been keeping secrets about Frank Stone, about this town, my whole life. Don't I deserve to know the truth?" For a moment, Sam looked older than Chris had ever seen him. He sank into the chair opposite his son, the weight of unspoken burdens evident in the slump of his shoulders. "The truth," Sam said, almost to himself. "The truth is a dangerous thing in Cedar Hills." Chris leaned forward, sensing a crack in his father's usually impenetrable facade. "What happened back then, Dad? What did Frank Stone really do?" Sam's eyes met Chris's, and for the first time, Chris saw real fear in them. "Frank Stone wasn't just a killer, Chris. He was something else. Something that should have never been let into our world." A chill ran down Chris's spine as he remembered the terrifying scene in the warehouse. "What do you mean, our world?" Sam ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted.
Cedar Hills sits on a boundary, a place where the fabric between realities is thin.
Most of the time it doesn't matter. But sometimes things slip through. Frank Stone. He found a way to use that to tap into powers no human was meant to wield. Chris's mind reeled. Everything they'd experienced, the strange occurrences at the mill, the cursed film fragment, the pocket watch incident, suddenly took on a new, terrifying significance. "The killings," Chris said slowly, "they weren't just murders, were they?" Sam shook his head. "They were rituals. Frank believed he could open a permanent gateway between worlds. He thought he was creating art, capturing moments of transcendence." The disgust in Sam's voice was palpable. "But all he did was invite in horrors beyond imagination." "But you stopped him," Chris said, clinging to the one part of the story he'd always believed. "You caught Frank Stone." A shadow passed over Sam's face. "We thought we did. We found his body in the deepest part of the still mill, surrounded by— I don't even have words for what we saw. We burned it all, sealed off that section of the mill, thought it was over. But it wasn't," Chris whispered, the pieces falling into place. Sam nodded grimly. Things kept happening. Disappearances, strange sightings. Nothing we could pin down, but the influence was still there. That's why we've worked so hard to bury the story, to keep people away from the mill. The less attention drawn to it, the weaker the connection. Chris's head was spinning. "Dad, we've been filming there. We found a hidden room, old newspapers, personal effects, and Aunt Bonnie gave us a piece of film." "What?" Sam's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. "Bonnie gave you part of Stone's film. Christ, Chris, do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" Before Chris could respond, a sharp knock at the front door made them both jump. Sam was on his feet in an instant, hand instinctively going to where his gun would be if he were in uniform. "Stay here," he ordered Chris, moving cautiously towards the door. Chris heard his father's sharp intake of breath as he opened the door. Then a familiar voice that made his blood run cold. "Good evening, Sheriff Green. I believe it's time we had a chat about your son's little project." Augustin Leiber stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed as always, a cold smile playing on his lips. Sam's voice was tight with barely contained fury. "You have no right to be here, Leiber. Our agreement," Augustin cut in smoothly, "was predicated on certain conditions. Conditions which, I'm afraid, are no longer being met." His gaze shifted to Chris, who had come to stand behind his father. "Isn't that right, young filmmaker?" Chris felt pinned by Augustin's stare, like a butterfly on a collector's board. "What do you want?" he managed to ask. Augustine's smile widened. "Why, to help, of course. Your father has been selective with the truth. I think it's time you heard all sides of this story." Sam moved to slam the door, but Augustine's hand shot out, holding it open with surprising strength. "You can't keep him in the dark forever, Sam. The wheels are already in motion. Frank Stone's legacy lives on, and your boy is right at the centre of it." For a tense moment, father and son stood frozen, caught between Augustine's ominous presence and the weight of long-buried secrets. Then, with a defeated sigh, Sam stepped back. "Fine," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But not here, not in my home." Augustine nodded, satisfied. The diner then, neutral ground, 1 hour. He turned to leave, then paused, fixing Chris with one last unsettling gaze. "Do bring that fascinating film strip of yours, won't you?" As Augustine's sleek car pulled away from the curb, Chris turned to his father. "Dad, what?" But Sam held up a hand, silencing him. "Get your coat," he said, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "And call your friend Linda. If we're doing this, you both need to hear it." As Chris reached for his phone, a sense of vertigo washed over him. The familiar contours of his life, his home, his father, his town, suddenly seemed alien and threatening. They were about to step off the edge of the known world, into the dark heart of Frank Stone's legacy. And somewhere in the shadows of Cedar Hills, ancient forces stirred, awakened by the curiosity of a young filmmaker and the long-buried secrets of a town that had never truly escaped its past. Chapter 9. Augustine's Offer. The neon sign of the Starlight Diner buzzed and flickered, casting an eerie blue glow over the nearly empty parking lot. Chris and Linda sat in his car, watching as Sheriff Sam Green's patrol vehicle pulled up alongside them. "You ready for this?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded, her face pale in the dashboard light. "Not really, but do we have a choice?" As they stepped out into the cool night air, Chris felt the weight of the film canister in his pocket. It seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as if aware of its impending revelation. The bell above the diner door chimed as they entered, the sound jarring in the tense atmosphere. Augustin Lieber was already there, occupying a booth in the far corner. His tailored suit looked out of place among the worn vinyl and chipped formica. "Ah, the young visionaries arrive," Augustine said, his voice smooth as oil. "And Sheriff Green, how good of you to join us. Please, sit." They slid into the booth, Chris and Linda on one side, Sam on the other, facing Augustine. A tired-looking waitress appeared, but Augustine waved her away with a polite smile. "Now then," he began, folding his hands on the table, "I believe we have much to discuss." Sam leaned forward, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "Cut the crap, Lieber. What's your angle here?" Augustine's smile never wavered. "Always so direct, Sam." "Very well. I'm here because your son and his charming friend have stumbled onto something quite significant, something that many people would pay handsomely to possess." Chris felt a chill run down his spine. "The film fragment," he said. "Precisely," Augustine nodded. "That little strip of celluloid is far more valuable than you can imagine. It's a key, you see, a key to unlocking powers beyond mortal comprehension." Linda's eyes narrowed. "And you want to buy it from us? Why not just take it?" Augustine's laugh was like ice cracking. "My dear, if it were that simple, don't you think I would have done so already?" "No, the film must be given willingly. That's part of its charm." Sam slammed his fist on the table, causing the salt and pepper shakers to rattle. "Enough. Chris, Linda, don't listen to him. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Oh, I think they have some idea," Augustine countered. "After all, they've seen things, haven't they? At the mill, in that charming little film project of theirs, they've glimpsed the truth that you've tried so hard to bury, Sam." Chris felt torn, caught between his father's obvious fear and Augustine's tantalizing hints at greater knowledge. "What exactly are you offering?" he asked, ignoring his father's sharp intake of breath. Augustine's eyes gleamed. Information, for starters. The true story of Frank Stone, unvarnished and uncensored, and, of course, financial compensation. Enough to fund your documentary and then some. All in exchange for that little strip of film. "Don't do it, son," Sam pleaded. "Whatever he's offering, it's not worth the cost." Linda had been quiet, her brow furrowed in thought. Suddenly she spoke up. "What if we don't give you the whole thing? What if we just let you see it?" Augustine raised an eyebrow, intrigued. An interesting proposition. "And what would you want in return?" "Information," Linda said firmly. "Not just about Frank Stone, but about Cedar Hills. About why our town is, the way it is. And protection. Whatever's happening, whatever we've stumbled into, we want assurances that we'll be safe." Chris stared at Linda, a mix of admiration and unease swirling in his gut. She'd always been the pragmatic one, but this level of negotiation with forces they barely understood was unexpected. Augustine leaned back, a look of genuine appreciation on his face. "Well played, my dear. I can see why young Christopher values your partnership." He paused, considering. "Very well. A compromise, then. You allow me to view the film here and now. In return, I'll provide you with information, carefully curated, of course, and a measure of protection. But be warned, knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. And in Cedar Hills, knowledge is a dangerous thing indeed." Sam looked ready to object again, but Chris cut him off. "We'll do it," he said, his heart racing. "But Dad stays. Whatever you show us, whatever you tell us, he's part of this too." Augustine's smile was predatory. "Of course. Family is so important after all." With trembling hands, Chris retrieved the film canister from his pocket. As he placed it on the table, the air in the diner seemed to thicken, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously. Augustine reached for the canister, but Linda's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "Information first," she said, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. For a moment, Augustine's mask of civility slipped, revealing something ancient and terrifying beneath. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by his usual smooth demeanour. "As you wish," he said, settling back into his seat. "Let me tell you about the true nature of Cedar Hills, about the cosmic forces that converge here, and about a man named Frank Stone who thought he could harness those forces for his own twisted art." As Augustine began to speak, weaving a tale of eldritch horrors and reality-bending rituals, Chris felt the foundations of his world begin to crumble. Beside him, Linda listened intently, her hand finding his under the table and squeezing tight. Across the booth, Sam's face was a study in anguish and resignation. Whatever secrets he had kept, whatever truths he had hidden, were now spilling out into the open. And, as the night wore on, as Augustine's words painted pictures of impossible geometries and sanity-shattering vistas, Chris realized that their little documentary project had become something far more profound and far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Outside the diner, unnoticed by those within, the shadows seemed to deepen and writhe, as if the very fabric of reality was responding to the revelations being shared. Cedar Hills held its breath, waiting to see what these young filmmakers would do with the terrible knowledge they were about to receive. Chapter 10. The Psychologist's Tapes. The basement of Cedar Hills Public Library was a labyrinth of dusty shelves and forgotten documents. Chris and Linda moved cautiously through the stacks, their flashlights casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the corners of their vision. "Are you sure about this?" Linda whispered, her voice tight with tension. "After everything Augustine told us." Chris nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We need to know the whole truth, Linda, not just Augustine's version, not just my dad's. If these tapes exist, they might be our best chance at understanding what really happened to Frank Stone." They had been searching for hours, combing through boxes of old records and artifacts deemed too sensitive for public viewing. The revelation that Dr. Augustine Lieber, a psychologist who had treated Frank Stone in the months leading up to his crimes, had left behind a series of recorded sessions was too tantalizing to ignore. "Chris, over here!" Linda's excited whisper cut through the musty silence. She was kneeling beside a battered cardboard box, its label faded but still legible, Lieber A patient files restricted. With trembling hands, Chris helped Linda lift the box onto a nearby table. Inside, nestled among yellowed folders and handwritten notes, was a set of old reel-to-reel tapes. "This is it," Chris breathed, running his fingers over the labels. Each was marked with a date and the initials FS. Linda pulled out an ancient tape player from her bag. "I can't believe your dad still had one of these." "Small-town sheriff," Chris shrugged, managing a weak smile. "Never throws anything away." As Linda set up the player, Chris selected the earliest tape. The air seemed to thicken as he threaded it through the machine, as if the very atmosphere was resisting their intrusion into the past. With a deep breath, Chris pressed play. At first there was only static, then a voice emerged, cultured, professional, with an underlying note of fascination. "Session 1 with patient Frank Stone. Mr. Stone, can you tell me why you're here today?" A pause, then another voice, low, intense, with an odd cadence that made the hairs on the back of Chris's neck stand up. "I'm here because they don't understand my work, Doctor. They see only the surface, the physicality of it. They cannot comprehend the depths I'm exploring." Dr. Lieber's voice again. "And what depths are those, Mr. Stone?" Frank's response sent a chill through Chris and Linda. "The spaces between realities, Doctor. The thin places where our world bleeds into others." As the tape continued, Frank Stone's delusions, if they could be called that, unfolded in terrifying detail. He spoke of visions granted to him by beings beyond comprehension, of rituals that could bend the fabric of reality, and of his quest to capture these cosmic truths on film. Chris and Linda exchanged glances, both pale in the dim light. Everything Augustine had told them, everything they had experienced, was being confirmed and expanded upon in Frank's own words. They listened through tape after tape, tracking Frank's descent into what seemed like madness, but which they now understood to be a horrifying form of clarity. Dr. Lieber's clinical detachment gradually gave way to a mix of fear and reluctant fascination. On the final tape, dated just days before Frank Stone's killing spree began, the doctor's voice trembled as he spoke. "Frank, I've seen the film fragments you left for me. I don't know how you created those images, those impossible geometries, but I'm begging you, stop this now. Whatever you think you're accomplishing, it's not worth the cost." Frank's laugh in response was chilling, a sound of pure nihilistic joy. "Oh, but it is worth it, Doctor. Every drop of blood, every scream, every moment of terror. It's all part of the grand design. My magnum opus is nearly complete, and when it is, well, Cedar Hills will be the focal point of a transformation beyond imagining." The tape clicked off, leaving Chris and Linda in stunned silence. "Chris," Linda finally whispered, her voice shaking, "what have we gotten ourselves into?" Before Chris could respond, a new voice cut through the darkness, causing them both to jump. "I was wondering when you two would find those." They whirled to see Augustine Lieber stepping out from behind a shelf, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "How did you?" Chris began, but Augustine cut him off with a wave of his hand. "I've been keeping tabs on your little investigation. I must say, I'm impressed by your resourcefulness." He moved closer, his gaze fixed on the tapes. "Those recordings are quite something, aren't they? The ravings of a madman, or the insights of a visionary. It all depends on your perspective." Linda stood, placing herself between Augustine and the tapes. "What do you want?" Augustine's smile was cold. "The same thing you want, my dear, the truth. But I wonder, are you prepared for what that truth might cost you?" Chris felt a surge of defiance. "We've come this far. We're not backing down now." Excellent, Augustine nodded, his approval sending a chill down Chris's spine. Then perhaps it's time for the next phase of your education. Those tapes are just the beginning, you know. Frank Stone left behind much more than just words. The film, Chris said, realization dawning. The complete version of what Aunt Bonnie gave us. Augustine's eyes glittered. Indeed. And I know where to find it. The question is, are you brave enough or foolish enough to seek it out? As Chris and Linda exchanged glances, weighing the implications of Augustine's words, the shadows in the basement seemed to deepen. The truth they sought was within reach, but the path to it was fraught with dangers they were only beginning to comprehend. And somewhere in the dark heart of Cedar Hills, in the depths of the still mill or the hidden corners of reality itself, the legacy of Frank Stone awaited, a cosmic horror captured on celluloid, ready to unleash its terrifying vision upon an unsuspecting world. Chapter 11, The Storm Drain Expedition. The entrance to Cedar Hills' storm drain system gaped before them like the maw of some subterranean beast. Chris, Linda, and a reluctant Robert stood at the edge, their flashlight beams barely penetrating the oppressive darkness beyond. "I can't believe we're doing this," Robert muttered, adjusting the straps of his backpack nervously. "Crawling through sewers based on the word of a guy who's probably as crazy as Frank Stone was." Chris couldn't blame him for his skepticism. After their encounter with Augustine in the library basement, the idea of exploring the town's underground network seemed both reckless and necessary. Augustine had hinted that the tunnels held secrets directly related to Frank Stone's work, and possibly another fragment of the infamous film. "They're storm drains, not sewers," Linda corrected, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "And we need to know the truth, Rob. After what we heard on those tapes." She didn't need to finish the thought. The memory of Frank Stone's voice calmly discussing cosmic horrors and reality-warping rituals still haunted them all. "All right," Chris said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this. Stay close, and if anyone feels like something's wrong, really wrong, we bail immediately." "Got it." With nods of agreement, they switched on their headlamps and entered the tunnel. The sound of their footsteps echoed ominously, the damp air thick with the scent of mold and decay. As they ventured deeper, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the tunnels were somehow alive, shifting subtly around them. More than once, he could have sworn he saw movement in his peripheral vision, only to find nothing but dripping walls when he turned to look. "Guys," Robert's voice was tight with tension, "does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Before Chris could respond, Linda gasped. "Look at this!" Her light illuminated a section of wall covered in intricate symbols, the same ones they had seen in the still mill and in the foreman's journal from Cher's shop. "It's like a map," Chris murmured, tracing the lines with his finger. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly at his touch, sending a jolt of energy up his arm. Suddenly, the tunnel behind them groaned, the sound of shifting stone echoing in the confined space. They whirled to find their entry point gone, replaced by a smooth, featureless wall. "What the hell?" Robert's voice cracked with panic. "Where's the way out?" Chris felt his heart racing but forced himself to remain calm. "It's okay, we'll find another way. Let's just keep moving forward." As they pressed on, the tunnels began to change in subtle, unsettling ways. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, taking on shapes that defied natural geometry. Linda, who had been meticulously mapping their route, suddenly stopped short. "This doesn't make sense," she said, staring at her notebook. "We should have hit the town square by now, but these tunnels, they're not following any logical layout." As if in response to her observation, the air around them shimmered, and for a brief, nauseating moment, Chris felt like he was looking at the tunnel from multiple angles simultaneously. When his vision cleared, he realized with a start that their surroundings had changed completely. Gone were the damp, concrete walls. Instead, they found themselves in what appeared to be an ancient cavern, its walls adorned with primitive paintings depicting otherworldly entities and impossible landscapes. "Oh God," Robert whimpered, "what's happening to us?" Before anyone could answer, a sound echoed through the cavern, a rhythmic chanting in a language that hurt the ears and mind to hear. Following the sound, they emerged into a vast circular chamber. In the centre stood a stone altar, and upon it, "Another film canister," Chris breathed, taking an involuntary step forward. As they approached the altar, the air grew thick and heavy, reality itself seeming to warp around them. Chris reached for the canister, his fingers tingling with an otherworldly energy. The moment he touched it, visions exploded behind his eyes. Flashes of Cedar Hills throughout different eras, glimpses of monstrous shapes lurking at the edges of perception, and always, always, the piercing gaze of Frank Stone, his eyes alight with mad inspiration. Chris stumbled back, the canister clutched to his chest. "We need to get out of here," he gasped. "Now!" But as they turned to leave, they found themselves face to face with a figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Sometimes a man in 1970s clothing, sometimes a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, but always with Frank Stone's unmistakable, manic grin. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere to the spaces between. "You've come so far, little filmmakers. Are you ready to see the truth behind the veil?" Linda grabbed Chris's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Chris, we need to run. That's not really him. It can't be." The Frank thing laughed, the sound rippling through multiple realities. "Oh, but it is me. More me than I ever was in life. And you, my young friends, are about to become part of something beautiful and terrible." As the figure advanced, reality buckled around them. Chris felt the ground beneath his feet become insubstantial, and suddenly they were falling, tumbling through a kaleidoscope of fractured timelines and impossible geometries. They landed hard on cold, wet concrete, the familiar sound of dripping water telling them they were back in the storm drains. But something was different. The air felt charged, alive with potential. "Is everyone okay?" Chris asked, his voice shaking as he helped Linda and Robert to their feet. They nodded, too shaken to speak. As they gathered their bearings, Chris realized he was still clutching the film canister from the altar. "We need to get this back to the others," he said, his mind reeling from their otherworldly encounter. "Whatever's on this film, it's the key to understanding what's really going on in Cedar Hills." As they made their way back to the surface, following a path that thankfully remained stable, none of them spoke of the visions they had seen or the encounter with the Frank thing. Some experiences were too profound, too terrifying to put into words, but as they emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, blinking like cave dwellers, they knew that their adventure in the tunnels had irrevocably changed them. They had glimpsed the truth behind Frank Stone's madness, had seen firsthand the cosmic forces at play in their small town. And somewhere in the depths of Cedar Hills, in the spaces between realities, ancient and terrible things stirred, awakened by the curiosity of young filmmakers who had dared to peer behind the veil of normalcy. The truth was within their grasp, captured on the film they had retrieved. But as they headed back to their makeshift editing studio, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that in seeking answers, they had set in motion events that would reshape not just their lives, but the very fabric of reality itself. Chapter 12, Betrayal Revealed. The makeshift editing studio in Chris's garage hummed with nervous energy. Equipment salvaged from the school's AV club cluttered every available surface, the walls plastered with timelines, photographs, and hastily scrawled notes. At the centre of it all sat the two film canisters, Bonnie's original fragment and the one retrieved from the tunnels, like silent harbingers of truths too terrible to contemplate. Chris, Linda, and Robert huddled around the editing table, their faces illuminated by the flickering screen of an ancient Steenbeck film viewer. The events in the tunnels had left them shaken, but the promise of answers drove them forward. "Are we really sure we want to do this?" Robert asked, his voice tight with anxiety. After what we saw down there, maybe some things are better left unknown. Chris met his friend's gaze, seeing his own fear reflected there. We're in too deep now, Rob. We need to know what's on these films, for the documentary, for the truth, for our own sanity. Linda nodded, her face a mask of determination. Chris is right. We can't stop now. With trembling hands, Chris loaded the first film strip, Bonnie's Fragment, into the viewer. The machine whirred to life, and images began to flicker across the screen. At first it seemed like nothing more than random blurry shots, a hand, a face, a swirling pattern of light and shadow. But as the film progressed, the images became clearer, more disturbing. They saw glimpses of the still mill, of dark rituals performed in hidden corners. And always, the piercing gaze of Frank Stone, his eyes alight with mad inspiration. "My God," Robert whispered, his face pale. What was he doing? Before anyone could answer, the film suddenly shifted. The images became more frantic, more alien. Impossible geometries filled the screen, punctuated by flashes of things that hurt the mind to perceive, writhing tentacles, eyes where no eyes should be, landscapes that defied the laws of physics. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The viewer clicked empty, leaving them in stunned silence. That can't be real," Linda said, her voice shaking. "It has to be some kind of special effect, right?" Chris shook his head slowly. "After what we saw in the tunnels, I think this is all too real."
He reached for the second canister, the one they had retrieved at such cost.
But before he could load it, a sharp knock at the garage door made them all jump. "Chris, you in there?" It was Sam Green's voice, tight with barely contained anger. Chris exchanged a panicked look with his friends before calling out, "Yeah, Dad." "Just working on the project." The door swung open, revealing not just Sheriff Green, but Augustin Leiber as well. The sight of the two men together, one the embodiment of Cedar Hills law, the other a mysterious purveyor of dark secrets, sent a chill down Chris's spine. "I think it's time we had a talk," Sam said, his eyes sweeping over the cluttered garage before settling on the film canisters. "About a lot of things." Augustine stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Linda. "Indeed, perhaps we should start with the arrangement Miss Chen and I came to." Chris felt his world tilt. "What arrangement?" he asked, looking between Linda and Augustine. "Linda, what's he talking about?" Linda's face crumpled, guilt and defiance warring in her expression. I made a deal with him, Chris. For protection, for information." "What kind of deal?" Robert demanded, his earlier fear giving way to anger. Augustine's smile was cold. "Ms. Chen agreed to keep me informed of your progress. In exchange, I provided certain assurances. And, of course, the location of that second film canister." Chris felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. You knew where it was all along." Linda stood, her fists clenched at her sides. "I did it for us, Chris. For the project. Augustine promised to keep us safe, to give us the real story. After everything that's happened, can you blame me for wanting some kind of security?" "Security." Chris laughed bitterly. "Linda, we almost died in those tunnels. If that thing, whatever it was, that's enough," Sam cut in, his voice sharp. "Now, you kids have no idea what you're meddling with. It's time to end this now." Augustine raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and how do you propose to do that, Sheriff? The wheels are already in motion. Frank Stone's legacy lives on, and your son and his friends are at the heart of it." Sam's hand moved to his holster, but Augustine just laughed. "Please. We both know your mortal weapons are useless against what's coming." As the adults argued, Chris felt a surge of determination. Whatever was happening, whatever dark forces were at play, he and his friends had stumbled onto something bigger than themselves. They couldn't back down now. "No," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "We're not ending anything. We're going to finish this documentary, we're going to uncover the truth about Frank Stone and Cedar Hills, and we're going to show the world what's really going on here." Augustine's eyes glittered with something like approval. "Brave words, young Christopher, but are you prepared for the consequences? The truth you seek may cost you everything." "It already has," Chris replied, glancing at Linda. The hurt of her betrayal was a raw wound, but he pushed it aside. There were bigger things at stake now. Sam looked between his son and Augustine, his face a mask of anguish and resignation. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Chris Frankstone. What he unleashed. It's not something that can be contained by a documentary." "Then help us understand," Chris pleaded. "No more secrets, no more lies, tell us everything." For a long moment silence reigned in the cluttered garage. Then, with a heavy sigh, Sam nodded. "All right, but not here. There's somewhere you need to see, somewhere that will make all of this terribly clear." As they filed out of the garage, Chris, Linda and Robert following Sam and Augustine, the air seemed to thicken with potential. They were on the cusp of revelations that would change everything, not just for them, but for Cedar Hills and perhaps the world beyond. And in the deepest corners of reality, in the spaces between what is and what could be, ancient and terrible things stirred. Frankstone's magnum opus was nearing completion, and the young filmmakers who had dared to peer behind the veil were about to become its unwitting stars. Chapter 13. The Prophecy of Pain. The old Chevy Suburban rumbled down a dirt road on the outskirts of Cedar Hills, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Inside, an uneasy silence reigned. Chris sat sandwiched between Linda and Robert in the back seat, acutely aware of the tension radiating from both of them. In the front, Sheriff Sam Green's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, while Augustine Leiber lounged in the passenger seat, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Where exactly are we going, Dad?" Chris finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Sam's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. "There's an old church out here, St. Algernon's. It was abandoned decades ago, but it holds answers." "Answers about Frank Stone." Linda leaned forward, her earlier guilt seemingly forgotten in the face of new information. Augustine chuckled softly. "Oh, my dear, Frank Stone is merely a footnote in a much larger story. What awaits us at St. Algernon's predates him by centuries." The road curved sharply, and suddenly the church loomed before them. It was a decrepit Victorian structure, its spire listing dangerously to one side. Vines choked the stonework, and most of the windows were shattered, giving the building the appearance of a corpse with empty eye sockets. As they exited the vehicle, Robert shivered visibly. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered. "As well it should," Augustine said, his voice unusually solemn. "St. Algernon's has borne witness to, let's call them cosmic events that would shatter most minds." Sam led them to a side door, fumbling with an ancient key. As the door creaked open, the smell of dust and decay washed over them. Chris flicked on his flashlight, revealing pews scattered like broken teeth and an altar draped in cobwebs. "This way," Sam said, moving towards a door behind the pulpit. They descended a narrow staircase into what appeared to be a crypt. But instead of tombs, the walls were lined with bookshelves sagging under the weight of ancient tomes and scrolls. Augustine moved with purpose, selecting a massive leather-bound volume from a far shelf. "Ah, here we are," he said almost reverently. "The Codex Doloris." "The what?" Chris asked, peering at the book's worn cover. Roughly translated, "The Book of Pain," Augustine explained. "It contains prophecies and accounts of, let's call them thinnings between our world and others."
Sam's face was grim.
"It's where we first learned about what Frank Stone was trying to do, and why we had to stop him." Augustine laid the book on a dusty table and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with intricate diagrams and text in a language Chris didn't recognize. But what caught his eye were the illustrations, grotesque depictions of tentacled horrors and impossible geometries that made his head hurt to look at. "The Prophecy of Pain," Augustine said, his finger tracing a particularly disturbing passage. It speaks of a time when the barriers between worlds will weaken, allowing entities beyond human comprehension to visit our reality. Linda leaned in, her face pale in the flashlight's beam. And Frank Stone knew about this. Sam nodded. He didn't just know about it, he was trying to fulfill it, his murders, his art. It was all part of a ritual to tear open the veil between worlds. Chris felt a chill run down his spine. But you stopped him, right? That's why you arrested him. A look passed between Sam and Augustine that made Chris's blood run cold. We thought we had, Sam said quietly. But now, with what's been happening with your film project, Augustine picked up where Sam trailed off. It seems Frank Stone's work was more enduring than we realized. The prophecy speaks of a great work that will bridge realities. We believed it referred to Stone's film, but perhaps it's our documentary, Chris finished, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Robert, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. Wait, are you saying our film project is? What? Fulfilling some ancient prophecy? That's insane. Is it? Augustine countered. Think about what you've experienced since you began this endeavor. The visions, the distortions of reality. You've been touching something far beyond your understanding, young filmmaker. Chris's mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't even realized were there, the strange occurrences at the mill, the tunnels, the fragments of Frank Stone's film. It was all part of something larger, something terrifying. What happens, Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper, if the prophecy is fulfilled? Augustine's smile was chilling. The thinning becomes a tearing. The entities that have been glimpsing our world through the cracks, they come through fully. Reality as we know it ceases to exist. A heavy silence fell over the crypt. The weight of what they had stumbled into pressed down on them all. Finally Chris spoke, his voice shaking but determined. So how do we stop it? Sam looked at his son with a mixture of pride and sorrow. That's the thing, Chris, we're not sure we can. The prophecy, it's not just a prediction, it's a blueprint. And you and your friends have been following it step by step without even knowing it. There is perhaps one way, Augustine said, his eyes glittering in the dim light. But it would require a sacrifice, a willingness to step into the void, to face what lies beyond. Chris felt Linda and Robert's eyes on him, looking to him for direction. He thought of everything they had been through, of the truths they had uncovered and the horrors they had glimpsed. He thought of Frank Stone, of the madness that had driven him to try and bridge worlds, and in that moment Chris knew that there was no turning back. Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, they had to see this through to the end. "Tell us what we need to do," he said, meeting Augustine's gaze steadily. As Augustine began to explain, the air in the crypt seemed to thicken, reality itself bending around the weight of the choices being made. And somewhere, in the spaces between worlds, ancient and terrible things stirred, sensing that their time was finally at hand. The prophecy of pain was unfolding, and Cedar Hills stood at the center of a cosmic drama that would determine the fate of not just their town, but of reality itself. And at the heart of it all was a group of young filmmakers who had set out to tell a simple story and found themselves caught in a narrative beyond their wildest nightmares. Chapter 14. The Summoning Ritual. The basement of Augustine Leiber's Victorian mansion thrummed with an otherworldly energy. Arcane symbols adorned the walls, pulsing faintly in the dim light. At the center of the room stood an ornate projector, its brass fittings gleaming ominously. Chris, Linda and Robert huddled near the stairs, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Sheriff Sam Green paced nervously, his hand never far from his holster. Augustine, however, moved with purpose, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling fervor. "Are you sure about this?" Sam asked, his voice tight with tension. "Assembling the full film. You know the risks." Augustine paused in his preparations, fixing Sam with a piercing gaze. "My dear Sheriff, we are long past the point of caution. The prophecy is unfolding whether we will it or not. Better to control the summoning than to let it happen by chance. Chris stepped forward, his heart racing. But what exactly are we summoning, and why do you need us here? Augustine's smile was cold. What we're summoning, young Christopher, is beyond human comprehension. As for why you're here, he gestured to the camera equipment they had brought. You're going to document it, of course. Your film project is the key to all of this. Linda's hand found Chris's, squeezing tightly. This is insane, she whispered. We should leave now. But Chris knew it was too late. They were too deeply entangled in whatever cosmic drama was unfolding. We need to see this through, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Augustine began assembling the film reels, fragments collected over decades, including the pieces Chris and his friends had discovered. As each segment clicked into place, the air in the basement grew heavier, reality itself seeming to warp around the edges. Cameras ready, Augustine instructed, his voice taking on an almost ritualistic cadence.
What you're about to witness has not been seen in its entirety since Frank Stone's final days.
With trembling hands, Chris and Linda raised their cameras. Robert manned the sound equipment, his face a mask of barely contained terror. Augustine flipped a switch, and the projector whirred to life. Light spilled onto the far wall, and for a moment it seemed like nothing more than jumbled, abstract images. But as the film progressed, the images began to coalesce into something. Other, impossible geometries filled the screen, punctuated by glimpses of vast, alien landscapes. And then, emerging from the chaos, a shape began to form, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, its very existence an affront to sanity. "My God!" Sam breathed, taking an involuntary step back. Augustine's voice rose, chanting in a language that hurt the ears to hear. The images on the screen began to pulse, to push against the boundaries of the projection. Chris felt a pressure building in his skull, as if reality itself was straining to contain what they were witnessing. And then, with a sound like reality tearing, something began to emerge from the screen. A tentacle vast and impossible pushed through the boundary between film and reality. It writhed in the air, sensing its new environment. Behind it, glimpsed through the tear in the fabric of the world, more shapes moved, titanic forms that the human mind couldn't fully process. "It's happening!" Augustine cried, his voice a mixture of terror and ecstasy. The veil is thinning. Chris kept filming, even as his instincts screamed at him to run. Through his viewfinder, he saw more tendrils pushing through, the air around them shimmering with otherworldly energy. Suddenly a scream cut through the chaos. Chris turned to see Robert collapsed on the floor, his eyes rolled back in his head, mouth open in a silent howl. Linda rushed to his side, but as she touched him, her body went rigid, eyes wide with some terrible vision. "Stop it!" Chris yelled at Augustine. "You're killing them!" But Augustine was beyond hearing, lost in his chanting, his eyes fixed on the ever-widening tear in reality. Sam moved to shut off the projector, but an invisible force knocked him back. Chris felt something wet on his upper lip and realized his nose was bleeding. The pressure in his head was unbearable now, filled with whispers of cosmic secrets no human was meant to know. With a Herculean effort, he raised his camera again, determined to document whatever was about to happen. Through the lens he saw the tentacles recede slightly, but the tear remained, a window into a reality so alien, so vast, that merely glimpsing it threatened to shatter his sanity. And then, emerging from that impossible space, a face appeared. It was Frank Stone's face, but twisted, changed. His eyes burned with eldritch fire, and when he spoke, his voice echoed from 1,000 throats. "The bridge is built," the Frank thing intoned. "The way is open. We come." With those words, the basement exploded into chaos. The tear widened explosively, and Chris was thrown back against the wall. His camera clattered to the floor, but it continued recording, capturing glimpses of what followed. Augustine, laughing maniacally as tentacles wrapped around his body, lifting him towards the rift. Sam, firing his gun uselessly at shapes that defied description. Linda and Robert, still locked in their cosmic visions, oblivious to the madness around them, and through it all, the voice of Frank Stone, layered with inhuman harmonics. The prophecy is fulfilled. The great work is complete. Cedar Hills will be the nexus of a new reality. Chris fought to stay conscious, even as his mind reeled from what he was witnessing. He could feel the foundations of the house shaking, hear distant screams from the town beyond. Whatever had been summoned, its influence was spreading. With the last of his strength, Chris crawled to his fallen camera. If this was the end, if reality as they knew it was about to be unmade, he was determined to record it. As his fingers closed around the camera, a new sound cut through the chaos. A high, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The tear in reality pulsed, and for a moment Chris thought he saw other faces in the rift, past victims of Frank Stone perhaps, or other unfortunate souls caught in this cosmic drama. The basement walls began to crack, light spilling through from some impossible source. Chris raised his camera one last time, focusing on the tear in reality, on the writhing shapes beyond, on the face of Frank Stone, laughing in triumph. And as consciousness finally slipped away, Chris had one final terrifying thought. This was only the beginning. Whatever had been set in motion here, in this basement in Cedar Hills, was about to reshape not just their town, but the very fabric of existence itself. The camera continued to record, bearing silent witness to the unfolding of a cosmic horror that defied comprehension. And somewhere, in the spaces between realities, ancient and terrible things surged forward, eager to explore the new realm that had been opened to them. Cedar Hills trembled on the brink of an apocalypse beyond imagining, and at its heart, a group of young filmmakers lay unconscious. Their simple documentary project having unwittingly ushered in the end of the world as they knew it. Chapter: Town in Turmoil. Chris Green awoke to the taste of ash and the sound of distant screams. His head throbbed with each pulse of the unearthly light that seeped through the cracks in Augustine's basement walls. Beside him, Linda and Robert stirred, their faces pale and drawn, eyes haunted by visions they couldn't articulate. "We need to get out of here," Chris croaked, his throat raw as if he'd been screaming for hours. As they stumbled to their feet, Chris noticed two things. Augustine was nowhere to be seen, and the tear in reality that had opened during the ritual was still there, a shimmering vertical pool of impossibility that hurt the eyes to look at directly. "Where's your dad?" Linda asked, helping a dazed Robert to his feet. Chris felt a stab of panic. "I don't know." "We have to find him." They made their way up the creaking stairs, each step an effort against the warped gravity of the house. When they finally burst out onto the street, the full extent of the chaos became apparent. Cedar Hills had become a nightmare landscape. The sky roiled with colours that shouldn't exist, and buildings seemed to shift and breathe like living things. Townsfolk ran through the streets, some screaming in terror, others laughing with manic glee as reality buckled around them. "Oh my God," Robert whispered, his earlier fear giving way to a sort of numb acceptance. "What have we done?" Before Chris could respond, a familiar voice called out, "Chris, over here." They turned to see Sheriff Sam Green waving frantically from the doorway of the Cedar Hills Gazette building. As they ran towards him, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the street itself was trying to hold them back, the asphalt becoming sticky and pliant under their feet. Once inside, Sam slammed the door shut, leaning against it as if to hold back the chaos outside. "Are you kids all right?" he asked, his eyes wild with a mixture of relief and lingering terror. Chris nodded, still trying to process what he'd seen. "Dad, what's happening out there? Where's Augustine?" Sam's face darkened. "Augustine, that fool. He thought he could control it, channel it. But the entity, whatever it is, it took him. pulled him through that tear in his basement. Linda, who had been peering out the window, suddenly gasped. "Guys, look!" They crowded around her, watching in horrified fascination as a group of townspeople marched down Main Street. At their head was Miss Castle, the eccentric librarian, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The procession moved with unnatural synchronicity, chanting in a language that made the air itself vibrate. "It's spreading," Sam said grimly. "Whatever came through, it's changing people, linking them somehow." As if in response to his words, the world outside seemed to flicker. For a moment they saw not the Cedar Hills of their time, but a patchwork of different eras. Horse-drawn carriages clattered past sleek, futuristic vehicles. People in colonial garb mingled with figures that seemed more machine than human. "Multiple realities," Chris breathed, his filmmaker's instincts kicking in despite the terror. "They're overlapping, bleeding into each other." Robert, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Guys, I can hear them, the others." "In my head." They turned to look at him, alarmed. Robert's eyes had taken on the same unearthly glow they'd seen in Miss Castle's. "Rob, fight it," Linda pleaded, grabbing his shoulders. "Whatever you're hearing, it's not real." But Robert just smiled, a serene expression that was somehow more terrifying than any fear. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "The unity, the purpose. We're all part of something greater now." Before they could react, Robert shoved past them, running out into the chaos-filled streets. They watched in horror as he joined the procession, falling into step as if he'd always been part of it. "We're losing them," Chris said, his voice cracking. "The town, our friends, everything's slipping away." Sam put a hand on his son's shoulder, his touch anchoring Chris in the swirling madness. "Not everything. Not yet. There might still be a way to stop this, to close that tear." "How?" Linda asked, tearing her eyes away from the window. "Augustine's gone, and he's the one who understood all this cosmic stuff." Sam's expression was grim. "There's someone else who might know. Someone who's been preparing for this day longer than any of us. We need to find Bonnie." The name hit Chris like a physical blow. His aunt, who had given them the first piece of the cursed film, who had always seemed to know more than she let on. "Last I heard, she was holed up in the old Rivera house," Sam continued. "But getting there won't be easy. The town, it's not just changing physically. The rules of reality don't quite apply anymore." As if to emphasize his point, a flock of birds flew past the window, except they weren't birds, but books, their pages flapping like wings as they soared through the impossible sky. Chris felt the weight of the camera still slung around his neck. Despite everything, the documentarian in him couldn't help but want to capture what was happening. "We need to record this," he said. "If we make it through, people need to know what happened here." Linda nodded, her own camera at the ready. "For better or worse, we started this with our film. Maybe finishing it is part of the solution." Sam looked like he wanted to argue, but instead just nodded. "All right, but we move fast and we stay together. The longer we're out there, the more we risk losing ourselves to, whatever this is." As they prepared to step back out into the chaotic streets of Cedar Hills, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were characters in a story spiraling out of control. The boundaries between fiction and reality, between past and present, between sanity and madness, all of it was blurring, shifting, rewriting itself with each passing moment. And somewhere, in the heart of this maelstrom of colliding realities, the presence they had unwittingly summoned was growing stronger. Frank Stone's face, twisted and impossible, seemed to leer from every shadow, every warped reflection. The great work was nearing completion, and Cedar Hills teetered on the brink of becoming ground zero for a cosmic transformation beyond imagining. As Chris, Linda, and Sam stepped out into the writhing chaos of Main Street, they knew that their next moves would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of reality itself. The camera rolled, capturing the unthinkable, and the story of Frank Stone, of Cedar Hills, of a simple documentary project that had cracked open the doors of perception, hurtled towards its cataclysmic conclusion. Chapter 16. The truth about Frank Stone. The Rivera house loomed before them, a Victorian monstrosity that seemed to ripple and shift in the unnatural light. Chris, Linda, and Sheriff Sam Green stood at the edge of the overgrown lawn, catching their breath after their harrowing journey through the chaos-stricken streets of Cedar Hills. "Are you sure Aunt Bonnie's in there?" Chris asked, eyeing the house warily. The windows seemed to blink, like giant lidless eyes watching their approach. Sam nodded grimly. "If she's anywhere, it's here. This house. It's been in your mother's family for generations. It has its own protections against things like this." As they approached the front door, the air around them thickened, as if they were walking through invisible syrup. Linda raised her camera, capturing the bizarre distortions. "It's like the house is trying to keep us out," she murmured. Before they could knock, the door swung open of its own accord. Bonnie Rivera stood in the doorway, her wild hair even more disheveled than usual, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and excitement. "I've been expecting you," she said, ushering them inside, "though I must admit I hoped it wouldn't come to this." The interior of the house was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Here, reality seemed more stable, though Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing in multiple versions of the same room simultaneously. Bonnie led them to a study lined with books and curious artifacts. At the center stood an old projector, not unlike the one Augustine had used in his basement. "I suppose you want answers," Bonnie said, sinking into an armchair that seemed to embrace her. "About Frank? About the entity? About all of this?" She waved her hand, encompassing the madness that had engulfed Cedar Hills. Sam stepped forward, his face a mask of guilt and determination. "It's time, Bonnie. They need to know everything." Bonnie nodded slowly, then fixed her gaze on Chris and Linda. "Frank Stone wasn't just a killer," she began. "He was a conduit, a bridge between our reality and something else." Chris felt a chill run down his spine. "The entity we saw in Augustine's basement." "Yes and no," Bonnie replied. "What you saw was just a fraction, a tendril of something far vaster. Frank, he could see it even as a child. The spaces between realities, the cosmic forces that shape existence itself." Linda leaned forward, her camera whirring softly as it recorded. "But the murders, why did he kill those people?" Bonnie's face darkened. "He believed he was, opening their eyes, elevating them. Each death was a ritual, a way of thinning the veil between worlds. And with each killing, he grew more connected to the entity." Sam cleared his throat, his voice heavy with long-buried guilt. "We thought we stopped him, the night we cornered Frank in the deepest part of the still mill. We found him in the middle of his final ritual. But we were too late." "What do you mean, too late?" Chris asked, dreading the answer. Bonnie answered for Sam. "The ritual was complete. Frank had become one with the entity. What your father and the others found that night wasn't just Frank Stone. It was something more." The implications hit Chris like a physical blow. "So when you arrested him, when you said you'd killed him," Sam nodded, unable to meet his son's eyes. "We couldn't kill it, not really. The best we could do was contain it. We used rituals of our own, bound it to the mill. We thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't," Linda said, the pieces falling into place. "It's been influencing the town all this time, hasn't it? Through the film fragments, through people's memories." Bonnie smiled sadly. "Smart girl. Yes, the influence never truly went away. It seeped into the fabric of Cedar Hills, waiting for the right moment, a right catalyst." The weight of her words settled over them. Chris felt a surge of guilt and horror. "Our documentary. We were the catalyst." Sam put a hand on his son's shoulder. "You couldn't have known, Chris. None of this is your fault." But Chris shrugged off his father's touch, anger and betrayal bubbling up. "You knew. You knew all along what was really happening in this town, and you kept it from me, from everyone. We thought we were protecting you," Sam said, his voice pleading. "If people knew the truth." "The truth?" Chris laughed bitterly. "Look outside, Dad. The truth is here, whether we want it or not." Bonnie stood suddenly, her eyes fixed on the window. "Speaking of which, we don't have much time. The entity. Frank. Whatever you want to call it, it's growing stronger. The barriers between realities are collapsing." As if to emphasize her point, the room around them flickered, briefly showing other versions of itself, sometimes opulent, sometimes decayed, sometimes not a room at all, but a vast, alien landscape. "So what do we do?" Linda asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "How do we stop this?" Bonnie moved to the projector, her hands caressing it almost lovingly. "We fight fire with fire." Or in this case, film with film. Frank's project was meant to tear open reality, yours. Yours might be the key to stitching it back together. Chris felt a glimmer of hope, but it was tempered by suspicion. "What aren't you telling us, Aunt Bonnie?" "What's the catch?" Bonnie's smile was sad and knowing. "The catch, my dear nephew, is that to close the rift, to push back the entity, we need a sacrifice. Someone to act as an anchor, to hold reality together while the rest of you complete the film." The implications hung heavy in the air. Sam stepped forward, his face set with grim determination. "I'll do it. This mess, I helped create it. It's only right that I—" "No," Chris interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "No more secrets, no more sacrifices. There has to be another way." But even as he said it, Chris could feel the wrongness of the world pressing in around them. Outside, the sky had become a writhing mass of impossible colours, and the sounds of terror and ecstasy mingled in the streets. Bonnie shook her head sadly. "I'm afraid there isn't, Chris. The choice is simple, one life or all of reality." As the weight of their situation settled over them, Chris felt a strange calm descend. He looked at his father, at Linda, at the aunt he'd never fully understood. Whatever happened next, he knew their lives would never be the same. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "Tell us what we need to do." Bonnie nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "It starts with the film, your film. The story of Frank Stone, of Cedar Hills, of the cosmic forces that shape our reality. But to make it work, to give it the power to push back against what's coming, you'll need to face Frank himself." The room seemed to darken at her words, shadows deepening in the corners. And for a moment, Chris could have sworn he saw a familiar face leering at him from the darkness. Frank Stone's face, twisted and impossible, yet undeniably present. As Bonnie began to outline their desperate plan, Chris felt the weight of the camera in his hands. Whatever happened next, he was determined to document it. For better or worse, their film had started this. Now, it might be the only thing that could end it. The final act of the casting of Frank Stone was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Reality itself hung in the balance, with Cedar Hills at the center of a cosmic drama that would determine the fate of not just their town, but of existence itself. Chapter 17, The Other Realm. The world twisted and warped around them as Chris, Linda, and Sheriff Sam Green made their way through the chaotic streets of Cedar Hills. They were headed for the Still Mill, following Bonnie's instructions to confront Frank Stone, or whatever he had become, at the source of his power. Suddenly, a rift opened in the air before them, a yawning void that pulsed with impossible colours. Before they could react, it expanded rapidly, engulfing them in a maelstrom of fractured reality. Chris felt himself falling, tumbling through layers of existence. He caught glimpses of other versions of Cedar Hills, sometimes pristine and idyllic, sometimes ravaged and apocalyptic. And through it all, he heard the maddening laughter of Frank Stone echoing across dimensions. When the vertigo finally subsided, Chris found himself alone in a place that defied description. The sky above was a roiling mass of tentacles and eyes, while the ground beneath his feet seemed to breathe and pulse with alien life. In the distance, impossible structures loomed, their geometry as an affront to Euclidean space. "Dad! Linda!" Chris called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. There was no response, only the distant, discordant piping of some unseen horror. Clutching his camera like a lifeline, Chris began to move forward. Each step was a struggle against gravity that seemed to shift and change on a whim. He focused on Bonnie's words, repeating them like a mantra. "The film is your weapon. Your story can reshape reality."
As he traversed the nightmarish landscape, Chris encountered fragments of Cedar Hills scattered throughout.
A mailbox here, a street sign there, all warped and twisted into new, unsettling forms. He documented everything, his filmmaker's instinct overriding his fear. Suddenly he heard a familiar voice calling out in distress. "Chris, help me." It was Linda, but her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Chris spun around, trying to locate the source when he saw her, or rather, multiple versions of her, each trapped in a different nightmarish scenario. In one, Linda was slowly sinking into a pool of what looked like liquid darkness, her eyes wide with terror. In another, she was being pursued by a creature that seemed to be made of writhing shadows and discordant sounds. A third, Linda was frozen in crystal, her face a mask of silent screaming. "Linda!" Chris cried out, torn between which version to help. As he approached the nearest one, however, the scene shifted and changed, revealing itself to be an illusion, or perhaps something worse. A booming laugh echoed across the landscape, and Chris whirled to see a massive face forming in the sky, Frank Stone's face, but distorted and cosmic in scale. "Welcome to my realm, young filmmaker!" Frank's voice reverberated through Chris's very being. "Do you like what I've done with the place? It's all thanks to you and your little project, you know. You've given me the final push I needed to bridge the gap between worlds." Chris raised his camera, focusing on the impossible visage above him. "Why are you doing this, Frank? What do you want?" The face in the sky grinned, an expression that sent shivers down Chris's spine. "Want. I want to remake reality in my image, to break down the barriers between what is and what could be. And you, my boy, are going to help me do it." The world around Chris began to shift and change once more. He found himself in a twisted version of the still mill, its corridors stretching into infinity, machines working on their own to produce nightmarish living films. As he navigated this labyrinth of industrial horror, Chris encountered more illusions. His father, trapped in an endless loop of arresting Frank Stone over and over. Robert, his body slowly merging with camera equipment until he became a grotesque hybrid of man and machine. Bonnie, surrounded by books whose words crawled across the pages like insects. "Your mind is an open book to me here," Frank's voice echoed from the walls themselves. "Your fears, your desires, your deepest secrets, all of it is fuel for my grand vision." Chris pressed on, fighting against the vertigo and the creeping madness that threatened to overwhelm him. He kept filming, instinctively knowing that capturing these horrors on camera was somehow important, perhaps even crucial to finding a way out. As he delved deeper into the heart of this other realm, Chris began to notice patterns in the chaos. Symbols and images from their documentary research appeared, twisted and exaggerated but still recognizable. It was as if the entity that Frank had become was using their own work as a template to reshape reality. Suddenly, Chris found himself in a vast chamber. At its center stood a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and celluloid, a living, breathing film projector that seemed to be the nexus of Frank's power in this realm. And there, trapped within the monstrous machine, were Linda and Sam, their bodies slowly being absorbed into the mechanism. "Dad! Linda!" Chris cried out, rushing towards them. But before he could reach them, tendrils of living film shot out, wrapping around his limbs and pulling him towards the machine. "Join us, Chris," Linda's voice echoed, but it wasn't really her. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "Become part of the grand narrative. Help us reshape existence itself." Chris struggled against the tendrils, his camera still clutched in his free hand. As he was drawn inexorably towards the monstrous projector, a realization struck him. This, too, was part of the story. Their story. With a supreme effort of will, Chris raised his camera and began to narrate, his voice steady despite his terror.
This is Chris Green, documenting the final confrontation with the entity known as Frank Stone.
We're trapped in a realm beyond human comprehension, but we will not submit. Our story, the true story of Cedar Hills and the cosmic forces at work here, will be told. As he spoke, the tendrils seemed to loosen their grip. The chamber around them flickered, as if Chris's words were causing reality itself to ripple and change. Frank's voice boomed once more, but now there was a note of uncertainty in it. "What are you doing?" Stop that. But Chris pressed on, his narration growing stronger. Frank Stone was once a man corrupted by forces beyond his understanding. But we will not let his madness destroy our world. This is our story, our reality, and we will fight to preserve it. The monstrous projector began to shudder and warp. Cracks appeared in the air itself, letting in glimpses of the real Cedar Hills beyond. As Chris continued to film and narrate, he felt a surge of hope. They weren't powerless after all. The documentary, their commitment to telling the truth, no matter how strange or terrifying, was a weapon against the cosmic horrors that threatened to unmake reality. With a final reality-shattering crack, the other realm began to dissolve around them. Chris felt himself falling once more, but this time he wasn't afraid. He kept his camera rolling, determined to capture every moment of their journey back to their own world. As Cedar Hills reformed around them, Chris, Linda and Sam found themselves back on the streets of their town, changed, shaken, but alive and free from Frank's direct influence. But even as relief washed over them, they knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The entity that Frank had become was still out there, still threatening to tear apart the fabric of reality. Their ordeal in the other realm had shown them the true scope of what they were facing, but it had also revealed their greatest weapon. As they regrouped, preparing for the final confrontation, Chris knew that the most important part of their documentary was yet to be filmed. The fate of Cedar Hills, and perhaps all of reality, would be decided by the story they chose to tell. Chapter 18, The Final Shoot. The abandoned soundstage at the edge of Cedar Hills stood like a sentinel against the writhing, impossible sky. Chris, Linda and Sam approached it warily, each step an effort against the warping reality around them. They'd gathered what equipment they could salvage, determined to complete their documentary, now not just a film, but a weapon against the cosmic horrors threatening to unmake their world. "Are you sure about this?" Sam asked, his voice tight with concern. "After what happened in that other place?" Chris nodded grimly, adjusting the camera on his shoulder. "We don't have a choice, Dad. Aunt Bonnie was right. Our film is the key to all of this. We have to finish it." Linda, her own camera at the ready, added, "It's like Chris said in that other realm. This is our story. We have to tell it, no matter what." As they entered the soundstage, the air seemed to thicken, reality bending around them like a lens coming into focus. The vast, empty space before them flickered, sometimes appearing as the interior of the still mill, sometimes as Frank Stone's childhood home, sometimes as vistas of alien worlds that hurt the mind to perceive. "Okay," Chris said, trying to steady his voice. "We need to recreate key moments from Frank's life and death. If we can capture the truth of what happened, maybe we can counteract the narrative he's been spinning." They set to work, transforming the soundstage into a patchwork of Cedar Hills history. As they did, the line between set dressing and reality began to blur. The props they placed seemed to take on a life of their own, growing and changing in ways that defied logical explanation. Sam, who had taken on the role of Frank Stone with grim determination, donned a costume that seemed to writhe and pulse against his skin. "It's like it's alive," he muttered, a note of fear in his voice. Chris focused his camera on his father and gasped. Through the lens he saw not Sam Green in costume, but Frank Stone himself, young, charismatic, and burning with an inner fire that was both alluring and terrifying. "Dad!" Chris called out, lowering the camera. But when he looked with his naked eye, it was just his father standing there, looking confused and concerned. "What is it, son?" Sam asked. Chris shook his head, trying to clear it. "Nothing. Let's start with Frank's first encounter with the entity. Places everyone." As they began to film, reality itself seemed to bend to the will of their narrative. The soundstage transformed completely, becoming the still mill as it had been decades ago. The scent of hot metal and machine oil filled the air, and the distant sound of working machinery echoed through the space. Linda, operating the second camera, called out in a shaky voice, "Chris, are you seeing this?" He nodded, unable to take his eyes off the scene unfolding before him. Sam, or was it Frank, moved through the recreated mill with purpose, his eyes darting to shadows that seemed deeper and more alive than they should be. "Action," Chris said, the word feeling heavy with cosmic significance. "Sam," Frank began to speak, his voice a blend of his own and something older, something alien. "I always knew there was more to the world than what we could see. But that day in the mill, I saw behind the veil. I saw the truth of reality, and it was beautiful and terrible." As he spoke, the shadows around him deepened, taking on impossible shapes. Through his viewfinder, Chris saw tentacles and eyes forming in the darkness, reaching out towards the actor-man memory before him. Suddenly, a scream tore through the air. Chris whirled to see Linda backing away from her camera, her face pale with terror. "It's in the lens," she gasped. "The entity? It's looking at us through the cameras." Chris felt it too, a presence pressing against his mind, trying to seep in through the very act of filming. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep the camera steady. "Keep going," he called out. "We have to finish this." They pressed on, recreating scene after scene from Frank Stone's descent into cosmic madness. With each take, the boundary between past and present, between fiction and reality, became increasingly blurred. At one point, Chris turned to give direction to his father, only to find Frank Stone himself standing there. Not the young Frank they had been portraying, but the Frank from the other realm, his form a writhing mass of film and flesh. "You think you can rewrite me?" Frank's voice boomed, shaking the very foundations of the soundstage. "I am the author of this story, not you." Chris felt a surge of defiance. "No, Frank, you're just a character now. A cautionary tale. And we're going to make sure the world knows the truth." He raised his camera, focusing on the monstrous form before him. As he did, he felt something shift in the air around them. The entity that Frank had become seemed to recoil, as if the mere act of being filmed was causing it pain. "Keep filming," Chris shouted to Linda, who had recovered her composure. "No matter what happens, don't stop." As their cameras rolled, capturing the impossible confrontation, Chris began to narrate. "This is the true story of Frank Stone and Cedar Hills. A tale of cosmic forces beyond human comprehension, of a man corrupted by power he couldn't understand, and of a town unknowingly caught in the crossfire of realities." With each word, each frame captured, the chaotic energies swirling around them seemed to coalesce, to take on form and meaning. The entity that was Frank howled in rage and desperation, its influence waning as the truth of its narrative was laid bare. Suddenly, a new voice joined the fray. Robert, whom they had thought lost to the entity's influence, staggered onto the set. His eyes were clear, free of the otherworldly glow that had possessed him earlier. "I remember," he gasped. "I remember everything. Quick, give me a camera." With 3 cameras now trained on the writhing form of Frank the entity, the tide began to turn. Reality reasserted itself, the impossible geometries and alien vistas receding like a tide going out. As they filmed the final moments of their documentary, Chris felt a sense of triumph mixed with profound sadness. They had faced the unknown, had peered behind the veil of reality, and had emerged changed but unbroken. The soundstage slowly returned to normal, the elaborate sets fading away to reveal the empty space they had started with. But the air still hummed with potential, with the sense that they had brushed against something vast and unknowable. As they lowered their cameras, exhausted but victorious, Chris looked at his father, at Linda, at Robert. They had been through hell together, had faced cosmic horrors and impossible choices. And they had emerged with a story that would shake the foundations of reality itself. "It's done," Chris said softly. "We've told the true story of Frank Stone." But even as relief washed over them, a nagging doubt remained. Had they truly defeated the entity, or merely pushed it back temporarily? And what consequences would their act of cosmic storytelling have on the fabric of reality? As they packed up their equipment, preparing to face whatever awaited them outside, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. The final chapter of The Casting of Frank Stone had yet to be written, and its conclusion would determine the fate of not just Cedar Hills, but of reality itself. Chapter: Augustine's Betrayal. The atmosphere in Cedar Hills was charged with an eerie calm as Chris, Linda, Robert and Sam made their way through the twisted streets. The chaos that had engulfed the town seemed to have receded, but an undercurrent of wrongness persisted. Buildings still occasionally shimmered with impossible geometries, and the sky above roiled with colours that shouldn't exist. "We need to get this footage to a safe place," Chris said, clutching the camera that held their completed documentary. "If what Aunt Bonnie said is true, this film is the key to pushing back against the entity for good." As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with Augustin Lieber. He stood in the middle of the street, impeccably dressed as always, a serene smile on his face that sent chills down Chris's spine. "Ah, our intrepid filmmakers," Augustine said, his voice smooth as silk. "I must congratulate you on your perseverance. You've accomplished something truly remarkable." Sam stepped forward, placing himself between Augustine and the others. "Where have you been, Lieber?" "We thought you were taken by the entity." Augustine's smile widened. "Oh, I was, and what an enlightening experience it was." He focused his gaze on Chris. "You've seen it too, haven't you, Christopher? The vast cosmic truth behind our petty reality." Chris felt a twinge of the otherworldly awareness he had experienced in the other realm. He tightened his grip on the camera. "What do you want, Augustine?" "Want? My dear boy, I want what I've always wanted. To see the great work completed." Augustine's form seemed to flicker, revealing glimpses of something inhuman beneath his polished exterior. Frank Stone was merely the beginning, a crude first attempt at bridging the gap between worlds. But you and your little film project have refined the process beyond my wildest dreams. Realization dawned on Linda's face. "You've been manipulating us from the start. The information you gave us, the hints about Frank's film." Augustine nodded, looking pleased. "Very good, Miss Chen. I knew your sharp mind would be an asset to this endeavour. Yes, I've been guiding you all along, nurturing your curiosity, your drive to uncover the truth. And now you've created the perfect conduit for the entity to fully manifest in our world." "We won't let that happen," Sam growled, his hand moving to his holster. Augustine laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. "My dear Sheriff, you don't have a choice. The wheels are already in motion. All that's needed now is the final sacrifice." Before any of them could react, the air around Augustine began to warp and twist. Tendrils of shadow shot out, wrapping around Chris, Linda, Robert and Sam. They struggled against the impossible bonds, but to no avail. "You see," Augustine continued, his form growing more monstrous by the second, "the entity requires a focused point of belief, of narrative power, to fully cross over. Your film, infused with the cosmic awareness you've gained, charged with the emotional energy of your experiences. It's the perfect vessel." Chris felt the tendrils tightening, pulling him and the others towards Augustine. Through the viewfinder of his camera, which he still clutched desperately, he saw the true form of what Augustine had become, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, with Frank Stone's face grinning madly at its centre. "All it needs now," Augustine Frank's voice boomed, "is the life force of those who created it. Your deaths, your final moments captured on film, will be the catalyst that reshapes reality itself." As they were dragged closer to the monstrous form, Chris's mind raced. Everything they had been through, everything they had learned about the cosmic forces at play in Cedar Hills, it all came down to this moment. Suddenly, a memory flashed through his mind. Aunt Bonnie's words about the power of their story, about using the film as a weapon against the entity. With a surge of desperate strength, Chris raised his camera. "If our story is so powerful," he shouted, "then let's see how it affects you." He hit the playback button, projecting their completed documentary onto Augustine's writhing form. The effect was immediate and shocking. Augustine, Frank howled in agony as the images played across his monstrous body. The truth of Frank Stone's corruption, the cosmic horrors they had witnessed, the resilience of Cedar Hills in the face of reality-bending forces, all of it seared into the entity's flesh like acid. "What are you doing?" Augustine screamed, his voice a mixture of rage and fear. "Stop this at once!" But Chris pressed on, and the others quickly caught on. Linda and Robert, still bound but able to move their arms, raised their own cameras, adding their footage to the assault. Sam, free of his bonds as Augustine's concentration wavered, pulled out his phone. "I've got Bonnie's original footage here," he said, holding it up. "Let's hit this bastard with everything we've got." As the combined power of their documentary played out, Augustine's form began to destabilize. The cosmic energy he had been channeling turned against him, ripping holes in the fabric of his being. "No," he howled, "you don't understand what you're doing. The great work, it must be completed." Chris stepped forward, his camera steady despite his exhaustion. "You're wrong, Augustine. The great work isn't about tearing reality apart. It's about facing the truth, no matter how terrifying, and choosing to remain human in the face of cosmic horror." With a final reality-shattering scream, Augustine's form imploded. The cosmic energy he had been containing rushed outward in a shockwave that knocked them all off their feet. As they struggled to their feet, they saw that Augustine was gone. In his place was a shimmering tear in reality, pulsing with otherworldly light. "It's not over," Sam said grimly. "That rift, it's a direct connection to the entity's realm. We need to close it, or everything we've been through will have been for nothing." Chris nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "Then we finish this where it all began. We need to get to the heart of the still mill." As they gathered their equipment and steeled themselves for the final confrontation, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were hurtling towards a conclusion that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of reality itself. The true nature of Augustine's betrayal had been revealed, but the cost of victory was yet to be determined. As they made their way towards the still mill, the very air around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the final reel of the casting of Frank Stone would play out. Chapter 20, The Heart of the Mill. The still mill loomed before them, a monolithic testament to Cedar Hills' industrial past, now warped by cosmic forces into something far more sinister. Chris, Linda, Robert and Sam stood at its entrance, their cameras at the ready, each feeling the weight of what lay ahead. "This is where it all began," Sam said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Where we thought we'd stopped Frank Stone all those years ago." Chris nodded, adjusting the settings on his camera. "And now we're going to finish it, for real this time." As they stepped into the mill, reality seemed to bend and warp around them. The interior shifted between past and present, between the mundane and the cosmic. Machinery that had been dormant for decades whirred to life, processing raw materials into impossible shapes that hurt the mind to perceive. "Stay close," Chris warned as they navigated the twisting corridors, "and keep filming. Our documentary is our strongest weapon against whatever's waiting for us." They descended deeper into the mill, the air growing thicker and harder to breathe. Strange symbols pulsed on the walls, reminiscent of the ones they'd seen in the other realm. The very fabric of reality seemed to thin as they approached the heart of the structure. Suddenly Robert stopped short, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" They all paused, straining their ears. At first there was nothing but the ominous creaking of the mill. Then faintly they heard it, a sound like celluloid running through a projector, but distorted, wrong somehow. It's coming from down there. Linda pointed towards a stairwell that seemed to descend into absolute darkness. As they made their way down, their flashlights barely penetrating the gloom, the sound grew louder. It was joined by other noises, whispers in languages no human throat could produce, the screech of reality tearing at the seams. Finally, they emerged into a vast chamber that defied the mill's apparent dimensions. It stretched out impossibly in all directions, its center dominated by a whirling vortex of cosmic energy. And there, suspended in the heart of the vortex, was a figure that was both Frank Stone and something far more terrible. "Welcome," the Frank Thing's voice boomed, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome to the Nexus Point, the place where all realities converge." Chris raised his camera, focusing on the writhing form before them. Through the viewfinder, he saw not just Frank, but glimpses of every version of Cedar Hills that had ever existed or could exist. "It's over, Frank," Chris called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "We know the truth. We've told your story, the real story." The Frank Thing laughed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Oh, but the story's not over yet, young filmmaker. In fact, we're just getting to the best part." Tendrils of energy lashed out from the vortex, wrapping around their legs, trying to pull them in. Sam fired his gun, but the bullets simply vanished into the swirling chaos. "Your weapons are useless here," Frank's voice taunted. "This is my realm now, where imagination and reality are one and the same." Chris felt the pull of the vortex, saw the fear on his friends' faces, but then he remembered Bonnie's words about the power of their story. With a surge of determination, he raised his camera higher. "You're right, Frank," he shouted. "This is where imagination and reality meet. So let's see whose story is stronger." He hit the playback button, projecting their documentary onto the swirling vortex. Linda and Robert quickly followed suit, adding their footage to the mix. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The vortex shuddered, its energies recoiling from the truth captured in their film. They saw flashes of Cedar Hills' history, of Frank's descent into madness, of the cosmic forces that had shaped their town's destiny. "No." The Frank Thing howled. "You can't rewrite me. I am the author of this reality." But Chris pressed on, his voice rising above the chaos. "You're wrong, Frank. You're not the author. You're just a character in a much bigger story, a story about human resilience in the face of cosmic horror, about choosing to remain human even when confronted with the impossible." As their combined footage played out, the vortex began to contract. The Frank Thing writhed in agony, its form fluctuating between human and monstrous. "You don't understand what you're doing," Frank's voice screamed, now tinged with desperation. "If you close the rift, you'll trap me here forever." Sam stepped forward, his face set with grim determination. "That's the idea, Frank. It's time for Cedar Hills to be free of your influence." The vortex contracted further, reality reasserting itself around them. But as it did, Chris noticed something alarming. The mill itself was beginning to collapse, unable to withstand the cosmic energies being unleashed. "We need to get out of here," Linda shouted over the din of twisting metal and crumbling concrete. But Chris hesitated, knowing that if they left now, there was a chance the rift wouldn't fully close. The entity that Frank had become might find a way to slip through again. In that moment of indecision, Sam met his son's eyes. An unspoken understanding passed between them. "Go," Sam said, his voice full of love and regret. "Get Linda and Robert out. I'll make sure this ends here." "Dad, no!" Chris cried, but Sam was already moving towards the collapsing vortex. "I love you, son," Sam called back. "Now go, tell our story. Make sure the world knows the truth about Cedar Hills." Tears streaming down his face, Chris allowed Linda and Robert to pull him towards the exit. As they ran through the disintegrating mill, he kept his camera rolling, capturing the final moments of the cosmic drama that had defined their lives. Behind them, they heard a final reality-shattering boom. The ground shook beneath their feet as they emerged into the open air, the still mill collapsing in on itself in a spectacle that defied physics. As the dust settled, an eerie quiet fell over Cedar Hills. The impossible colours faded from the sky, the twisted geometries of the buildings slowly returning to normal. Chris, Linda and Robert stood in stunned silence, their cameras still raised, documenting the aftermath of their cosmic encounter. Is it over?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chris nodded slowly, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through, everything they'd lost. "I think so. But the story, our story, it's not quite finished yet." As they turned to face the town that had been forever changed by the events they'd witnessed, Chris knew that the final chapter of the casting of Frank Stone was yet to be written, and it would be up to them to ensure that the truth, in all its terrible, wonderful complexity, would be told. Chapter 21. The Ultimate Choice. The aftermath of the Still Mills collapse hung over Cedar Hills like a shroud. Chris, Linda and Robert stood at the edge of the newly formed crater, their cameras capturing the last wisps of otherworldly energy dissipating into the air. The town around them was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. "We should check on the townspeople," Linda said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. "Make sure everyone's okay." Chris nodded absently, his mind still reeling from the loss of his father and the cosmic horrors they'd witnessed. But as they turned to head back into town, a familiar voice stopped them in their tracks. "I'm afraid it's not over yet, young filmmakers." They spun to see Aunt Bonnie emerging from the settling dust, her wild hair even more dishevelled than usual, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of sorrow and determination. Aunt Bonnie. Chris stepped towards her. "What do you mean it's not over? We closed the rift, we stopped Frank and the entity." Bonnie shook her head sadly. "You've contained it, yes, but at a terrible cost. And now you face an even greater challenge." As if summoned by her words, the air around them began to shimmer and warp. Reality itself seemed to thin, revealing glimpses of other Cedar Hills. Some pristine and untouched by cosmic forces, others twisted beyond recognition. "What's happening?" Robert asked, his camera whirring as he documented the impossible scene. "The cosmic forces you've been dealing with, they don't just affect our reality," Bonnie explained. "Every choice, every action creates ripples across multiple dimensions. And now those ripples are converging." Chris felt a weight settling on his shoulders, a sense of cosmic responsibility he couldn't quite comprehend. "What does that mean for us? For Cedar Hills?" Bonnie's gaze fixed on Chris, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. "It means you have a choice to make, Christopher. A choice that will determine the fate of not just our Cedar Hills, but countless others across the multiverse." The air around them solidified into what seemed like windows into other realities. In one, Chris saw a Cedar Hills untouched by Frank Stone's madness, his father alive and well. In another, he glimpsed a world where the entity had fully manifested, the town a writhing mass of cosmic horror. "The barriers between realities are at their weakest now," Bonnie continued. "You have the power to choose which version of Cedar Hills becomes the prime reality, the one that all others will align with." The implications hit Chris like a physical blow. "You're saying I can save Dad? Undo all the horror we've been through?" Bonnie nodded slowly. "You could, but every choice has consequences. Save your father, and the cosmic truths you've uncovered remain hidden. The entity might find another way to manifest in the future. Choose a reality where the horror is fully realized, and you might gain the power to fight it on a cosmic scale, but at the cost of unimaginable suffering." Linda stepped forward, her face pale. "There has to be another way. We can't just choose one reality and doom all the others." "That's part of the choice," Bonnie said softly. "Do you choose one reality, or do you find a way to bridge them all? But be warned, trying to maintain multiple realities could shatter your mind, leave you lost in the spaces between worlds." Chris felt the weight of the camera in his hands, the story they'd captured suddenly seeming both vitally important and woefully inadequate in the face of this cosmic decision. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I even begin to make this choice?" Bonnie placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him in the swirling chaos of possibilities. With the very thing that brought you this far, your story, the truth you've captured on film, use it to shape the reality you believe in. Chris looked at Linda and Robert, saw the trust and fear in their eyes. He thought of his father's sacrifice, of the horrors they'd witnessed, of the cosmic truths they'd uncovered. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. Raising his camera, Chris began to speak, his voice growing stronger with each word. This is the story of Cedar Hills. Not just one Cedar Hills, but all of them. A town that stands at the crossroads of realities, that has faced cosmic horrors and emerged scarred but unbroken. We've seen the darkness that lies beyond the veil of reality, but we've also seen the light of human resilience, of love and sacrifice in the face of the unknowable. As he spoke, the windows into other realities began to shift and merge. Linda and Robert raised their cameras as well, adding their perspectives, their truths to the narrative. We choose not one reality, but the truth of all realities, Chris continued. We choose to remember the horrors we've faced, to honour the sacrifices made, and to stand guard against the darkness that always lurks at the edges of existence. We choose to be the watchmen, the storytellers, the ones who keep the cosmic balance. The air around them churned with impossible energies. Chris felt his consciousness expanding, touching the minds of other crises across countless realities. He saw infinite versions of Cedar Hills, of his friends and family, all converging on this singular moment of choice. In every Cedar Hills, in every reality, let the truth be known. Chris's voice echoed across dimensions. Let our story be a beacon, a warning, and a call to remain human in the face of cosmic indifference. With a reality-bending surge of energy, the windows into other worlds shattered. Chris, Linda, and Robert found themselves back in their Cedar Hills, the one they'd fought for and bled for. But something had changed. They could feel it in the air, in the very fabric of the town. As the dust settled and the first tentative rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Chris lowered his camera. He felt different, expanded somehow, as if a part of his consciousness now touched every version of Cedar Hills across the multiverse. "What did you do?" Linda asked, her voice filled with awe and a touch of fear. Chris looked at his friends, then out at the town that had been forever changed by their choices. "I chose us, all of us, every Cedar Hills, bound together by the truth of our experiences. We're the guardians now, the keepers of the story." As they made their way back into town, ready to face whatever consequences their choice had wrought, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. It was a new beginning, one that spanned realities and would require them to be vigilant against threats both cosmic and mundane. The ultimate choice had been made. Now they had to live with it, across every version of Cedar Hills, in every reality where the name Frank Stone still echoed with otherworldly resonance. Chapter 22. Reality Unravels. The decision to bridge all realities, rather than choose a single one, had consequences beyond what Chris, Linda, and Robert could have imagined. As they made their way back into Cedar Hills, the very fabric of existence seemed to stretch and tear around them. Buildings flickered in and out of focus, sometimes appearing as they had before the cosmic incursion, other times warping into impossible architectures. Townspeople walked the streets in a daze, their forms occasionally blurring as if multiple versions of themselves were trying to occupy the same space. "What's happening?" Linda asked. Her camera trained on a tree that was simultaneously blooming and withering, its leaves cycling through seasons in a matter of seconds. Chris felt the weight of his choice pressing down on him. "The realities are trying to align," he said, his voice distant as if part of him was still touching the minds of countless other crises across the multiverse. "But there's too much." Dissonance. Robert pointed down the street, his hand shaking. "Guys, look!" They turned to see a familiar figure striding towards them, Augustin Liber, or rather multiple versions of him overlapping and shifting. In one moment he appeared as the suave manipulator they had known, in another a monstrous amalgamation of flesh and celluloid, and in yet another a being of pure cosmic energy. "Did you really think it would be that simple?" Augustine's voice boomed, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "That you could just choose to bridge realities without consequences?" Chris raised his camera, focusing on the shifting form of their nemesis. "We chose the truth, Augustine. All of it, not just the parts that suited us." Augustine laughed, the sound distorting reality around them. "Truth. There is no singular truth, young filmmaker, only perspectives, narratives, and power."
As he spoke, the air behind Augustine began to tear, revealing glimpses of the otherworldly realm they had encountered in the still mill.
Tentacles and impossible geometries pushed through the rift, reality buckling under the strain. "You've weakened the barriers between worlds," Augustine continued, his form growing more monstrous with each word. "And now, the entity, the true power behind Frank Stone's madness, will finally manifest fully in this realm." Linda and Robert flanked Chris, their cameras at the ready. "We beat it once," Linda said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We'll do it again." But Chris knew this was different. He could feel it in the expanded awareness he now possessed. This wasn't just a fight for their Cedar Hills, but for all Cedar Hills across the multiverse. "We need to stabilize reality," he said, an idea forming. "Our documentary, it's not just a record of what happened. It's a focusing lens for all the different versions of our story." Robert nodded, understanding dawning. "A narrative anchor point." "Exactly," Chris said. "We need to broadcast our story not just to our town, but to every Cedar Hills in every reality." Augustine's laughter took on a manic edge. "You still don't get it, do you? Your little film is nothing compared to the cosmic forces at play here. You are insects trying to comprehend the movements of galaxies." As he spoke, the rift behind him widened. The entity began to push through, a vast writhing mass of tentacles, eyes and mouths, each one screaming in languages that hurt the mind to hear. Chris felt panic rising, but he pushed it down. He thought of his father's sacrifice, of Aunt Bonnie's wisdom, of every version of Cedar Hills fighting its own battle against cosmic horror. "Quick," he said to Linda and Robert, "patch your cameras into the local TV station's broadcast. I've got an idea." As they worked to connect their equipment, Chris turned to face Augustine and the emerging entity. He raised his camera, focusing not just on the horrors before him, but on the totality of Cedar Hills across all realities. "This is Chris Green," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Reporting from Cedar Hills, every Cedar Hills. We stand at a crossroads of realities, facing a threat beyond human comprehension. But we are not alone. In every version of our town, across countless dimensions, we have faced the darkness and emerged, scarred but unbroken." As he spoke, reality seemed to stabilize around them. The flickering of buildings and people slowed, as if the very fabric of existence was listening to his words. Linda and Robert joined in, their cameras capturing different angles of the cosmic confrontation unfolding before them. Their voices blended with Chris's, creating a harmony that resonated across dimensions. "We are the storytellers, the witnesses, the guardians of truth. We have seen behind the veil of reality and chosen to remain human in the face of cosmic indifference. This is our story, not just of one Cedar Hills, but of all Cedar Hills." Augustine howled in rage, his form destabilizing as the power of their narrative took hold. "You cannot rewrite reality with mere words." But Chris pressed on, feeling the connection to every other version of himself, of his friends, of his town. "We don't seek to rewrite reality, Augustine. We seek to understand it, to face it honestly, in all its terror and wonder." Frank Stone's legacy isn't one of fear and madness, it's a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. As their words echoed across realities, the entity's advance slowed. The rift began to close, reality knitting itself back together not into a single fixed point, but into a tapestry of interconnected possibilities. Augustine's form flickered and faded, his voice becoming distant. "You don't know what you've done. The story, it's not over." With a final reality-shaking roar, the entity was pulled back through the closing rift. Augustine vanished, his presence scattered across dimensions. As silence fell over Cedar Hills, every Cedar Hills, Chris, Linda and Robert lowered their cameras. The town around them settled into a new equilibrium, forever changed but unbroken. "Is it over?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chris shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, it's not over, it's just the beginning. We've got a story to tell, across every reality where Cedar Hills exists." As they stood there, witnesses to a cosmic drama beyond imagination, they knew that their work was far from done. The entity was contained, but not destroyed. Augustine was gone, but his influence might linger. Cedar Hills had become a nexus point in the multiverse, a place where the boundaries between realities were thin. And they, armed with cameras and an unshakable commitment to the truth, had become its guardians. The sun began to rise over Cedar Hills, its light seeming to shine not just on their town, but on countless versions of it across the cosmos. A new day was dawning, bringing with it challenges and wonders they could scarcely imagine. But they would face it together, their cameras ready, their stories still unfolding. Chapter 23. The Final Cut. The makeshift editing suite in Chris's garage hummed with an energy that was both familiar and alien. Equipment salvaged from the school's AV club mingled with devices that seemed to phase in and out of reality, their origins clearly not of this world. Chris, Linda and Robert hunched over the central workstation, their faces illuminated by the glow of multiple screens showing footage from across realities. "We've got to finish this," Chris said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "The entity may be pushed back, but it's not gone. Our film. It's the key to keeping the realities stable." Linda nodded, her fingers flying over a keyboard that occasionally sparked with otherworldly electricity. "I've never edited across dimensions before, but there's a first time for everything, right?" Robert managed a weak laugh. "Just another day in Cedar Hills. Pass me that interdimensional hard drive, would you?" As they worked, splicing together footage from their harrowing journey with glimpses of other Cedar Hills across the multiverse, the air around them shimmered with potentiality. Each cut, each transition seemed to resonate, not just through their equipment, but through the fabric of reality itself. Suddenly a tremor shook the garage. Outside, the sky flickered between normal and the roiling, impossible colours they had seen during the height of the cosmic incursion. "It's not over," Chris realized, a chill running down his spine. "The entity. It's making one last push." As if in response to his words, their screens filled with static, images of cosmic horror bleeding through. The voice of Augustine Libber, distorted and inhuman, echoed from unseen speakers. "Did you really think your little movie could stop the inevitable? Reality is fracturing, and no amount of editing can put it back together." Chris felt panic rising, but he pushed it down. He looked at the footage before them, not just their own experiences, but the stories of countless Cedar Hills, each facing its own version of cosmic horror. "No," he said, his voice growing stronger. "This isn't just our movie, Augustine. It's the story of every Cedar Hills, every person who's faced the unknown and chose to remain human. And we're going to make sure that story is heard." With renewed determination, they threw themselves into the final edit. Chris's expanded consciousness, still touching the minds of other crises across realities, guided their choices. Linda's technical skills, enhanced by her brush with cosmic forces, wove the disparate footage into a cohesive whole. Robert's unwavering belief in the power of their story infused every frame with purpose. As they worked, the garage around them began to shift and change. Walls became permeable, showing glimpses of other editing rooms in other realities. They saw versions of themselves, some nearly identical, others wildly different, all engaged in the same crucial task. "We're not alone," Linda breathed, awe in her voice. "Every version of us, they're all working on this." Robert nodded, his eyes wide. It's like we're creating a lens, focusing all our experiences into one definitive narrative. The tremors intensified. Outside, they could hear the panicked cries of Cedar Hills residents as reality buckled and warped. But in the editing suite, surrounded by the power of their collective story, they found a calm center in the storm. "Almost there," Chris murmured, his hands moving with otherworldly precision across the controls. "We just need to." Suddenly, every screen in the room flared to life. The composite image they had created, a tapestry of experiences from across the multiverse, began to play. But it was more than just a film now. Each frame pulsed with cosmic significance, the truth of their experiences radiating out across dimensions. Augustine's voice returned, but now it was tinged with fear. "What have you done?" "The barriers. There." Chris stood facing the main screen. He felt the presence of every other Chris, every other Linda and Robert standing with him. When he spoke, it was with the voice of all of them. "We've done what storytellers have always done, Augustine. We've taken the chaos of experience and given it form. We've looked into the abyss of cosmic horror and chosen to remain human. This is the true power of narrative, not to control reality, but to help us navigate it, to find meaning in the face of the unknowable." As the final cut of their film played out, reality itself seemed to hold its breath. The tremors subsided, the impossible colors in the sky faded. In their place, a new stability took hold. Not the rigid, unchanging reality of before, but a dynamic equilibrium. Countless versions of Cedar Hills existing in harmony. Augustine's presence faded, overwhelmed by the power of their collective narrative. The entity, glimpsed briefly in the corners of their vision, retreated to the spaces between realities, held at bay by the strength of their story. As the final frame faded to black, Chris, Linda and Robert stood in stunned silence. They could feel the reverberations of their work echoing across the multiverse, countless versions of Cedar Hills finding a new balance. "We did it," Linda whispered, tears in her eyes. "We actually did it," Robert laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Best documentary ever, hands down. No other film can claim to have saved reality itself." Chris smiled, feeling the weight of their accomplishment. But he also felt the responsibility that came with it. "It's not over," he said softly. "This film, it's not just a record of what happened, it's a shield, a beacon. We need to make sure it's seen, understood." They nodded, understanding the task ahead of them. As they stepped out of the garage into a Cedar Hills forever changed by their experiences, they knew that their work as chroniclers of the cosmic and guardians of reality was just beginning. The sun rose over Cedar Hills, every Cedar Hills, marking the start of a new era, an era where the boundaries between realities were known, where the cosmic truths they had uncovered would shape the future of not just their town, but of existence itself. And at the heart of it all was their film, the casting of Frank Stone, a testament to the power of storytelling in the face of cosmic horror, a bridge between realities, and a reminder of what it means to be human in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than they had ever imagined. Chapter 24. The Endless Reel. 1 year had passed since the day reality itself had been rewritten in Cedar Hills. The town looked much the same as it always had, quaint houses lining quiet streets, the still mill a silent sentinel on the outskirts. But for those who knew where to look, the signs of change were everywhere. Chris Green stood at the edge of the newly constructed Cedar Hills Multiversal Museum, his camera in hand as always. The building shimmered slightly, its architecture subtly defying the laws of physics as it existed partially in multiple realities at once. "Ready for the grand opening?" Linda asked, joining him on the steps. Her own camera hung around her neck, a permanent fixture now. Chris nodded, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "As ready as we'll ever be. Is Robert inside?" "Setting up the main exhibit now," Linda confirmed. "He's got a flair for the dramatic, I'll give him that." As they entered the museum, they were greeted by displays that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Artifacts from across the multiverse, each telling a piece of the Cedar Hills story, lined the walls. In the centre of the main hall, a replica of the still mill stood, occasionally flickering to show its counterparts in other realities. Robert waved them over to where he was adjusting the central piece of the exhibit, a state-of-the-art holographic projector that would showcase their documentary, The Casting of Frank Stone. "Just in time," he said, grinning. "I was about to start without you." As the small group of Cedar Hills residents began to filter in for the private opening, Chris felt a familiar presence at his side. Aunt Bonnie, looking both older and somehow more vibrant than ever, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done good, kid," she said softly. "Your father would be proud." Chris felt a pang at the mention of his dad, but it was tempered by the knowledge that in some realities Sam Green was still alive, still protecting Cedar Hills in his own way. "Thanks, Aunt Bonnie," he replied. "I just hope this is enough, that we're doing the right thing by sharing all of this." Bonnie's smile was enigmatic. "Knowledge is power, Christopher, and with great power comes great responsibility," Chris finished, chuckling. I know." As the crowd settled in, Chris stepped up to the podium. He looked out at the faces before him, friends, neighbours, fellow survivors of cosmic events beyond imagination. And behind them, visible only to those who knew what to look for, the shimmer of other Cedar Hills, other audiences, watching from across the multiverse. "Thank you all for coming," Chris began, his voice steady. "A year ago, our town, every version of our town, faced a threat beyond comprehension. We stood at the precipice of cosmic horror, stared into the abyss of reality's unravelling, and we survived." He gestured to the exhibits around them. "This museum stands as a testament to that survival, to the indomitable human spirit in the face of the unknown. But it's also a warning, a reminder of the responsibility we now bear." Linda and Robert joined him at the podium, a united front. Linda spoke next, her voice clear and strong. "The boundaries between realities are thin in Cedar Hills. We stand at a crossroads of infinite possibilities, infinite dangers. Our documentary, The Casting of Frank Stone, is more than just a film. It's a shield, a beacon, a guide for those who find themselves facing the cosmic unknown." Robert picked up the thread, "But it's also a celebration of who we are, not just as residents of Cedar Hills, but as human beings. We've seen wonders and horrors beyond imagination, and we've chosen to remain true to ourselves, to our humanity." As they spoke, the holographic projector flickered to life. Images from their harrowing journey played out in the air before them. The still mill, Frank Stone's twisted visage, the entity from beyond, and the countless versions of Cedar Hills that had faced their own trials. Chris felt a surge of emotion as he watched the familiar scenes. He saw the fear in their eyes, but also the determination, the unwavering belief in the power of their story. He saw his father's sacrifice, Augustine's betrayal, the cosmic forces that had nearly torn reality apart. But most of all, he saw hope. Hope in the face of the unknowable, courage in the depths of cosmic despair. This museum and the film at its heart serve as both history and guide, Chris continued. For those of you who live through these events, it's a reminder of what we've overcome. For those in other realities who may face similar challenges, it's a beacon of hope, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest moments, humanity can prevail. As the introductory speech concluded and the first full showing of their documentary began, Chris stepped back, watching the faces of the audience. He saw wonder, fear, recognition and understanding play out across their features. In that moment, he felt the weight of their new role as guardians of this multiversal nexus. The entity was contained, but not destroyed. Augustine was gone, but his influence might linger in unexpected ways. The story of Frank Stone, of Cedar Hills, of cosmic forces beyond comprehension. It was a story that would need to be told and retold across realities and generations. As the film played on, Chris felt a subtle shift in the air. For just a moment, he could see beyond the walls of the museum, beyond the boundaries of their reality. He saw countless versions of this scene playing out across the multiverse, different faces, different buildings, but the same story at its core. And in each of those realities he saw versions of himself, of Linda and Robert, standing guard against the darkness. They were no longer just filmmakers or students. They had become chroniclers of the cosmic, guardians of reality itself. The reel of their lives, of their story, would continue to unspool. There would be new challenges, new horrors to face, but they would face them together, armed with the power of truth, of narrative, of the unbreakable human spirit. As the lights came up and the applause began, Chris exchanged glances with Linda and Robert. No words were needed. They knew that this wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. The casting of Frank Stone had set in motion events beyond imagination, and their role in the cosmic drama was far from over. Outside the museum, Cedar Hills went about its day, the sun shining down on a town that existed in many realities at once. And in the spaces between those realities, in the cosmic depths where entities beyond comprehension dwelled, a new balance had been struck. The story of Cedar Hills, of Frank Stone, of cosmic horror and human resilience would echo across the multiverse. And at its heart would always be three young filmmakers who had looked into the abyss and chosen to keep rolling, to keep telling the story, no matter what terrors or wonders awaited them. The endless reel of their adventure continued, unspooling into a future as vast and mysterious as the cosmos itself. The end.